All right, hey everybody, this is James Lindsay, and you're listening to the new Discourses Podcast, and we have a question to investigate today, and that question is, were the communists atheists? The answer is yes and no. Not to be that guy, but it kind of depends on what you mean by atheist, and not like in some kind of pedantic way. Certainly the communists were atheist in the sense that they did not explicitly believe in God, but they did have a belief in something that's transcendent to themselves, which is in history itself as a transcendent object with a purpose and an end point that is in fact eschatological. And they kind of see man, not as in an individual you or me or this man or that man, but man overall as his own God. And that kind of counts, frankly. Communism's a religion. Now, why am I going to talk about this? I'm going to take us through at least little pieces, in some cases very little, pieces of 4 sources from Karl Marx and today. And we're going to talk about the relationship that Marx had to religion and belief and to God a little bit. And the reason is because what I've perceived is that a lot of conservatives, and particularly conservative Christians, have a pretty poor understanding of what's going on with regard to Marx and religion. They don't understand what Marx was doing with the atheism. Of course, they also don't know Marx's history with religion. And therefore, it's very common to kind of incorrectly, believe that the reason that the communists are communist is because they're atheist, as though atheism is causal to communism. Now, there are lots of atheists who are libertarians and, in fact, rampant individualists, like Ayn Rand, for example, who are pretty anti-communist. So obviously there are examples where that doesn't follow. But there's this belief that somehow the atheism tends to track into the communism. And this is a pretty severe misunderstanding of Marx and what he was doing with religion. And belief in God. And so the point of the podcast is going to be to kind of pull back that curtain, explain what's going on here. And there's a lot of kind of things to touch on. First of all, if you want to, I encourage you to go back and listen to my recent podcast that I titled, Are the Woke Right MAGA's So-Called New Atheists? I put new atheists in quotes. And the reason I would encourage you is not just to hear the podcast, I know the provocative title and all that, or even the argument of the podcast, but rather because I give in the middle of that podcast an argument for why socialism very frequently follows in the atheist context, which is in much briefer form that a lot of people who don't believe in God realize that we have big problems that can be solved through corporate action or collective action. And they do so in a way where they think, well, if we just got the government to basically come in and start solving a lot of our problems and dedicating resources as kind of this extension or embodiment of the people and its general will, that's a very Rousseauian approach, then we could solve our own problems. And, that's kind of what people believe that God is doing on kind of a, spiritual or supernatural or metaphysical scale. And so there is this tendency. So the conservatives and Christians who believe that there is like a tendency that atheism can open a door to socialistic thinking, which I guess could become communist. They're not wholly wrong. I'm not saying that this is complete nonsense, but they're really missing a lot of important points. Now, what about Marx and his religious history? We'll briefly touch on this. I'm drawing what I'm going to say from my recollection of Paul Kenger's book, The Devil and Karl Marx, which is something of a very curious and very important, in my opinion, biography of Karl Marx. It's off the beaten track. But I'm also doing this as a recollection of what that book says. So I may be drawing from, confabulation of memory from a couple other sources. In other words, what I'm saying is I don't have Kangaroo's book in front of me. I haven't read it in over a year. I've read other things since. I might be mixing some other stuff, but I'm going to give a very rough religious biography of Karl Marx. Obviously, the radicals on the right like to insist that Karl Marx was Jewish and that communism is Jewish. And is there truth to this claim? Well, the answer is kinda, but no. More no than yes. Ethnically, yes, but since when does somebody's ethnicity impact what they can and cannot think about or how they think? I mean, I guess that's an open question, but I don't think it's a very open question. Certainly people of different ethnicities have adopted very many cultural views of all different kinds all over the world with different beliefs and different political perspectives, so it's not a very strong argument that because his family had Jewish members that Karl Marx is somehow going to have Jewish tendencies. That said, his parents converted to Lutheranism from Judaism, either just before Marx was born or very early in his childhood. And Marx was raised as a Lutheran in, if I'm not mistaken, southwestern Germany. And so he was raised as a Lutheran. He wrote about this somewhat as a teenager, and then as he got into his later teen years, he decided he was an atheist, but he also felt not just that he rejected the idea of God, but also that he had identified with the character of Mephistopheles as presented in Johann Goethe's rendition of Faust. And so Goethe's Faust has the character Dr. Faust make a deal with the devil. The intermediary on behalf of Satan is this character Mephistopheles, and for whatever reason, Marx got very enraptured with the poet and the poetry and the story of Faust, and in fact with the character of Mephistopheles, who he would frequently quote. The very famous articulation that becomes the basis for the critical theory, over about a century later, I guess. The ruthless criticism of all that exists that Marx gave actually came from a paraphrasing of a line from Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust. And that line is something to the effect of ruthless criticism of all that exists because all that exists deserves to perish. That being the satanic view put into the mouth of the voice of Satan or the emissary of Satan in that drama, that play, epic poem, I guess. And so Marx, somewhere around the age of 18 or 19, certainly by 19, started writing overt poetry, not to God, but to Satan. He said he was taking up his lot. So if we're tracking his religious history, he has Jewish ethnicity that's not a religion or a religious belief, was raised as a Lutheran, eventually abandons it as a teenager for whatever set of reasons, and then ends up taking up with Satanism by his late teens, writes this kind of very weird poetry. Then he goes on, he writes some of his more important works that we're going to talk about today in his early 20s, by his mid-20s, and then by the end of his 20s, he's writing the Communist Manifesto in 1848. And so in between his, Lutheranism to atheism to Satanism, he picks up philosophy. He's studying Feuerbach and Hegel. He's disgusted with Hegel for being too spiritualist and actually criticizes him as being a theologian pretty vocally, and takes up with Feuerbach's kind of very strict materialism, which he says also doesn't go far enough. So you could say atheism is materialism. You don't believe there's a supernatural realm. Everything's just material. But Marx had a dual meaning for the concept of materialism. It's not just that we inhabit a material world in entirely material circumstances, which is a kind of metaphysical presupposition, but it's also Marx's materialism, when he uses it, doesn't just mean that we live in a material world. And again, a lot of the people I'm trying to reach with this podcast, which is largely conservative Christians who are anti-Marxist, but don't really understand this. They don't understand I want to help them understand there's a second dimension by what Marx means by being materialist. What he means by materialist is that your material conditions condition who you are. You are the product of your material conditions. This is sometimes called sociological materialism, and Marx gave criticisms of Feuerbach, saying that his materialism only went halfway because it didn't go into this sociological materialism. And the doctrine that Marxism actually espouses is something that's called material determinism. I'm not going to go into it, but this is kind of the view that he expresses, maybe a full decade later in 1852, writing in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, and he explains that men, he says, write their own history, but they don't make their own history, but they don't make it under conditions of their choosing. And the idea is that your material conditions, whether you're in a slave economy, a feudal economy, a capitalist economy, whether you're in the oppressor class or the oppressed, whether you're a bourgeoisie or a capitalist, or whether you're a proletarian or whatever, or a lumpen proletarian, all of these things determine your outlook on life. You are determined by your material conditions, which is a very Gnostic way of viewing the world. You have, as Heidegger put it later, been flung into your conditions beyond your choosing, and you've been determined, you've been delimited in what you can understand, and the limits of your class or critical consciousness, or even lack thereof, of your false consciousness, are all outlined by your material conditions that shape your life. This is extremely important to understand about Marxism, that your material conditions shape your character, because this is exactly the view that the entire Marxist operation runs on. The goal of seizing the means of production is to seize the means of production of your material circumstances so that they can seize the means of production of you, of society and the people in it. And I gave long lectures on this a couple of years ago in 23, talking about the Gnosticism of Marxism. I did some podcasts, but I also gave 2 different lecture series out in a church in Arizona, one in June and one in December, totaling almost 13 hours of lectures between the 2, explaining these ideas, the Gnosticism buried in Marxism. And in this case, the lecture that you would want to hear, I think, is the last of the 6. And that lecture is As Below, So Above, where I explain that what Marx does is believe that if you can do your radicalism at the bottom and transform the consciousness of the people at the bottom, then you can seize the means of production at the top and use that to condition people in society through the processes of what he called the inversion of praxis. So you do your praxis because that's within your power to do that. You transform through a political revolution the circumstances of the state, and then you are the above at that point, so you can then use inversion of praxis to brainwash everybody to become increasingly socialist. I digress. So the point is that Marx is clearly some kind of a Gnostic mystic who has tucked this, not just through Hegel and not just through Feuerbach, but through his own inventions on the 2, deeply into a philosophy of materialist or socioeconomic Gnosticism. I've called it socio-Gnosticism or sociological Gnosticism in the past in those same lecture series. And so he's gone now from Jewish ethnicity with some family heritage to being raised Lutheran, to becoming an atheist, to becoming a Satanist, to becoming a communist, with this particular set of views, where communism is in fact a profound Gnostic faith tucked into the material realm rather than the spiritual realm. The entire point of Marxism is that material conditions alienate most men. There's an alien power out there that alienates most men. That alien power is the bourgeoisie that alienates most men from their true nature, which is as socialists, which is a higher elevated spiritual nature of man that has been lost because of the entrance into the world of private property, which is then organized by the ruling class, the bourgeois class in the capitalist phase of history, to condition man to think that he's supposed to be an individual and not a socialist. And this is, if you don't understand this about Marxism, I hate to tell you, you don't understand anything. So this is the religious progression of Marx in kind of a short summary. Jewish heritage, raised Lutheran, rejects for atheism, picks up Satanism, combines all of this with his readings of philosophy, if we use that word, mysticism really, through Hegel and Feuerbach and Rousseau and some of the other socio-Gnostics, adopts a socio-Gnostic position, channels it into this doubly materialist philosophy called communism, which becomes his Gnostic religion. And so it is not correct, now that I've said this, but now we can start turning to reading some Karl Marx directly. It is not correct to say that Karl Marx or communism or Marxism is atheist in the sense of like having no religion, or that it's secular even in the sense of having no religion. It has none of the established religions, which is a different thing. It has rejected Christianity and Judaism in particular very explicitly, as we will hear in this episode, taking some risks on that for you. And then the other religions are no better in his mind. The abolishing of all religion is necessary in order to what? And so here's the big kind of punchline. I know we're 15 minutes in or so, and we're finally getting to it. And this is going to set the stage. The metaphor that I tend to give for what atheism represents within the Marxist or communist Gnostic faith is, I want you to imagine that you buy a piece of property, maybe you buy a few acres, and it's got a nice plot, and you want to turn it into like, not just a garden, but like a proper, little mini farm or whatever, right? You're going to grow some stuff. You're going to grow a stand of corn and some tomatoes and whatever else, or maybe you're going to go commercial and grow something. Doesn't matter. You have land. It has plants growing on it. You want it to become a garden to grow specific plants. That's the thing I need you to have. So imagine you're going to carve out half an acre of this piece of property you bought, and you're going to turn it into a dedicated growing area. You're with me? Okay. That piece of property, when you bought it, we're going to assume, was not already geared up to garden on or to farm on. It was, in fact, grass, or it had other things growing on it, whatever. And if you want to grow crops, corn and tomatoes or whatever it is you feel like growing on that land, the first thing you have to do is plow. You have to dig up the sod if it's grass, and then plow and prepare that land to be a plot farmland or garden. That's the atheism. We'll say it's just grass. The lawn that exists are the existing religions of the society. And what Marxism does with atheism is it has to dig them up. But it's not to be atheist. The purpose of communism is not to be atheist. Atheism is a kind of, as they see it, precondition of becoming communist, although you don't even have to really do that, as they later discovered. You can become communist through liberation theology, through a distortion, I should say, of Catholic theology, which is called liberation theology. You can become communist through the social gospel, which was a Baptist distortion of Baptist or Protestant theology, and you could draw other lines through other religions however you want. But at the time, the belief was that you have to get the other religions out of the way so you can grow the religion of communism. So if you want to grow your crops, you've got to get the grass out of the way. So you clear out the Judaism and Christianity, in particular in Germany, and then you allow on that new bare soil, you plant the seeds of communism and have them grow. So communist religion is like a new set of crops on a piece of land that previously was growing the other religions. So the atheism of communism is just getting the other religions out of the way so that communism can grow. That's the punchline. That's the whole point. The relationship between religion and Marxism is that it has to get the other religions out of the way because they are competitor religions, so it can grow the socio-Gnostic religion of communism in its place. Now that I've said that, let's read some Karl Marx. Let's see what he had to say about this. And hopefully this won't be too long. I've taken a few selections. I actually took the time rather than reading entire sources. I'm going to start with a remark in the Communist Manifesto. I really should do some podcasts properly about the Communist Manifesto. Normally I say the Communist Manifesto just has this preface and these two chapters. It's about 12 or 13 pages long. It's not very long. And then there's a bunch of him arguing about stuff afterwards. That's not entirely correct. If you scroll down a little further, at least in most of the published versions that I've seen maybe 3 different versions published, but certainly the one that Marxists.org offers, there's also a section where it lists out all the priorities and points of communism. It's kind of like a Q&A, primarily, if I'm guessing, by the quality of writing with Engels, but Marx likely contributed as well. And the Communist Manifesto is uncommonly well written for Marxist crap because it was mostly written by Engels, by the way. Marx was, just to point it out, not that great of a writer, as we will hear when we read Marx without the help of somebody else. But here's one of the questions given in this Q&A section at the bottom of the Communist Manifesto is, what will be its attitude, meaning the attitude of communism? What will be its attitude to existing religions? And the answer that they give is, all religions so far have been the expression of historical stages of development of individual peoples or groups of peoples. But communism is the stage of historical development which makes all existing religions superfluous and brings about their disappearance. So a lot of people believe that communism is going to come in and force religion out of the way. And in practice, especially in places like Soviet Union and China, People's Republic of China, that's exactly what it did. But that's not what the manifesto says. It says that religions are particular pieces of the stage of development of various cultures and peoples. And this is going to be really important. But they're a low level of development. This is the Gnostic pattern. Yeah, that's great. You're a Christian. That's primitive. We're moving on to the next more advanced stage, which is socialism or communism. This is where Antonio Gramsci famously said that socialism is precisely the religion that must overcome Christianity. It's going to replace it. Okay, but communism, it says, is the stage of historical development. So the stage of historical development where you need Judaism is one, and then later Judaism becomes Christianity is another. But eventually, he says, the stage of historical development will arise where you don't need religion. It becomes unnecessary and superfluous. It doesn't do for people what it had been doing. Therefore, it will bring about their disappearance. But they're very specific. Communism is the stage of historical development which makes all existing religions superfluous and brings about their disappearance. Communism is the new religion that's going to replace them. That's the idea. That's why I give this, plot of land farming metaphor. Okay, so we have a basis here. So the Communist Manifesto does not say specifically that the goal is going to be to abolish religion. It is that it sees religion as something for primitive screwheads, and that the more advanced elements of society, socialism and communism, won't be religious because they won't need religion. They will actually answer the questions for people that religion is currently answering, and people will say, my gosh, I never needed that in the first place. It was like a crutch, and I can put it down. So that is a place to start. Now, 4 years before they published the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx was in Paris, having been chased out of Germany, and I think he had been chased out of Switzerland at this point too. He'd been chased out of several places for basically causing low-level Antifa like mayhem and being a general lout and a troublemaker and a degenerate and whatever else. And he ends up in Paris for a little while. The French eventually kicked him out too, so he ended up in London, which is where he's buried today in Highgate Cemetery. People have seen the picture. They know what happened. And so while he's in Paris, at least in 1844, he's writing this document that has come, these three documents, really, these three manuscripts that have come to be called EPM, the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. He's basically formulating his worldview in these documents, both in terms of economics and what he calls philosophy, but it's really religion, the religion of communism, and he's laying this out. I find this to be arguably the most important thing that Marx wrote for understanding Marx, not Capital, not the Communist Manifesto. And he has some thoughts about the nature of atheism and its relationship to communism in there that I think are very important for people to understand. This manuscript, the Economic Philosophic Manuscripts, are sometimes therefore called, because he was writing them in Paris, the Paris manuscripts, and they're sometimes also called the 1844 manuscripts, because that's what year he wrote them. And it turns out, as a weird quirk of history, it's somewhere near the Sorbonne, but I'm not exactly sure where, somewhere near Notre Dame, but I'm not quite sure where. Like I said, in Paris, the room in which Marx was writing these manuscripts was apparently, if you were to look out the window, it was visible to the same room that the Pope at the time was writing his anti-communist views in 1843 and 1844, and they could have basically seen each other, in theory at least, or nearly so, out the window from one another while they were writing the most pro and anti-communist documents in existence to date at the same time. Kind of a neat story, and it reminds you how small the world can be. But at any rate, I digress. So here's what Marx has to say, I think, is a good starting point for what atheism represents with regard to communism. He says communism begins from the outset with atheism. And so all of my, poor deracinated Christians are like, aha, Lindsay, you're wrong. Of course, James, he said it right there. Communism begins with atheism. And that's the thing that they would run up on stage and misquote and misunderstand and mislead their audience with, probably not on purpose. Communism, he says, begins from the outset with atheism, but listen to how he finishes the sentence. But atheism is at first far from being communism. Indeed, that atheism is still mostly an abstraction. So if you remember Hegel's formulation of the dialectic, it's abstract, negation, concrete, right? And so communism is actually the concrete version of what begins with a very abstract atheism. You overcome your reliance on God. That's part of being an atheist for Karl Marx, as we will hear. That's very abstract. It doesn't actually mean anything. And then you are going to negate your negation of the reliance on God to arrive on the reliance of man as a collective entity, which is communism. And so that's your abstract negation, concrete formulation of Hegel's dialectic being applied here. So here, that's what he's actually hearkening to. It's hard to explain Marx and understand Marx because you actually have to know a lot of things that he's drawing on. But atheism is at first far from being communism, is very important. It's like having plowed your field, but it's very far from having a stand of corn. You have to plant the corn, you have to grow the corn, you have to tend to the corn, but you have produced some preconditions that will allow for corn. And again, I just remind you that the communists later refuted Marx on this by creating liberation theology and took people directly into communism. For example, Dom Elder Camara, directly in from being a Catholic integralist, as a matter of fact, which is exactly what that Pope was writing about in the way across. So he's like the anti-communist, Dom Elder Camara, and he gets sucked in by liberation theology there in Recife, Brazil, and becomes kind of an arch-communist character. And so he never went through an atheist stage. He went from Catholic integralist to liberation theologian, which is a Catholic communist. But at any rate, Karl Marx elaborates. He says the philanthropy of atheism is therefore at first only philosophical abstract philanthropy, and that of communism is at once real and directly bent on action. So he's saying that just getting over God, becoming an atheist, so to speak, is barely cutting it at all. Communism's a lot more than that, right? He's very clear about that. And what he's saying here is because it's abstract, if you just don't believe in God, that's all very philosophical. But the problem is, as we're going to hear throughout the podcast, is that you haven't discovered that the real conditions for suffering in the world can be answered by the communist socio-gnostic religion, which is going to make it, quote unquote, real and directly bent on action, theory, and praxis being wedded. So let me read this same piece. We will end with the same piece, but I'm going to read a paragraph and a half before this in EPM now to give you the context. Now that we know where he's going, what's the relationship between communism and atheism? Atheism is a fruitful ground to start. It's like a cleared field from which you can grow a crop of communists. That's what he claims. So there is some argument to be said that if you have a devout religion that you hold to, like Christianity or Judaism, that it's going to be harder to get you to become a communist. Although I point out again, liberation theology and the social gospel show that those can be subverted from within directly to communism. You can skip the relinquishment of your religion stage and go straight from one religion to a socio-gnostic interpretation of it on the other end. And this is actually very serious. But there is some argument to say that if you had a clean biblical Judaism or Christianity, that you have a strong resistance against becoming communist. So guess why the communists hate Jews and Christians so much? It's because they have a faith that really gets in the way. It's like having something really good in that field that's not going to get out of the way very easily for you to be able to plant your crops. So here's the greater context from EPM, another paragraph and a half behind. We'll hear how good of a writer Karl is as we proceed. He says, "It is easy to see that the entire revolutionary movement necessarily finds both its empirical and its theoretical basis in the movement of private property," which is to say the economy. The movement of private property is the economy. More precisely, he says, in that of the economy. So I didn't make that up. There he says it too. Okay. This material immediately perceptible, notice that he's talking about something that's real and tangible right in front of your face, not spiritual and mystical out there. This material immediately perceptible private property, he says, is the material perceptible expression of estranged human life. So that means human life, this is why it's Gnostic, is supposed to be at once immediate and sensual and connected and all these different things. But whoops, we have private property in the way. So private property takes you and divorces you from who you really are. Private property and the recognition of private property, which means the recognition of the fundamental right to exclude others who don't have a rightful claim to that property from that property, is considered the fall of man in the communist socio-gnostic religion. So this material, immediately perceptible private property is the material, perceptible expression of estranged human life. Its movement, remember that's the economy, he summarizes as production and consumption, is the perceptible revelation of movement of all production until now. That is the realization or the reality of man. So when man looks in the mirror, philosophically speaking, and says, "Who am I? What does it mean to be who I am?" What he's saying is that man is the realization of the reality of man. Man is the sum total of the conditions that brought him into being at that period in time. And that sum total of conditions is the movement, production, and consumption, or the economy of private property. And this is a perceptible revelation, he says, of the movement of all production until now. So all of history. So who are you? You are the period at the end of the sentence of history that is still being written. And so imagine like you've got your word processor and you've written a sentence and you decide you want to add more to the sentence. So you've already written the period and you push back by one character and you write up with the period moving out in front of you. Man is the period as history is being written like that sentence. And it is the entire history of man encapsulated as the history of its economy, the movement of private property through production and consumption that defines who you are. In other words, there's your material determinist doctrine that I said before in the sociological materialism that Marx said goes beyond Feuerbach. Religion, he says, and there's our key word, right? Religion, family, state, law, morality, science, art, etc., are only particular modes of production and fall under its general law. So what he's saying there is all these pieces of your identity that you recognize, your religion, your family, the nation you belong to, the law that you adhere to and follow, the morality that you think matters, the science that you study and apply to life, the art you enrich yourself with and enjoy and produce, everything, etc. Those are just particular modes of the production of man and fall under its general law, which I just described, which is basically private property, controlled, alienating or estranging man from who he really is in a socio-economic Gnostic sense. He goes on, and you've heard the famous thing that communism is the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement, and thus a complete return of man to himself as a social, therefore human being, which is from EPM also. It's a couple paragraphs above this, in fact, a little bit before it. Well, he goes on and says, the positive transcendence of private property, that is communism, as the appropriation of human life, which is how you recover yourself from the estranged state. In other words, it's the religious completion in his Gnostic religion is communism. The positive transcendence of private property as the appropriation of human life is therefore the positive transcendence of all estrangement. That's what I just told you in plain English, and he finished the sentence. That is to say, he says, the return of man, return to what? Return with a V, like the woke right? Return of man from his estranged or alienated state, his Gnostic alienation from who he really is in his true nature. So that is to say, the return of man to his true nature from religion, family, state, etc., to his human, which he says is social existence. In other words, you're coming back home. You're going to be a human again. And at home, you're fully human because you're a socialist. And so transcending private property by becoming a communist, in other words, growing the crop of communism in that field you've cleared out of the way, is your return to who you really were as a socialist. And it gets you out of those particular modes of production of religion, family, state, law, morality, science, art, etc. This is what the point is with communism. It's this, everything in society is organized to keep you from understanding who you really are, and it all boils down to private property and the fundamental right to exclude, which he explains produces an individuality, thus the abolishment of private property, but actually more its transcendence in a communist sense. Adopting this communist faith will rescue you from your own self-imposed alienation through having the wrong beliefs that are the result of the material determinism of all of history that has made you who you are now. You are always the man at the end of history who's still writing its next chapter. He gets more specific about religion. He says religious estrangement as such occurs only in the realm of consciousness, of man's inner life. But economic estrangement, he says, is that of real life. So religion is just in your head. You're estranging yourself from your true being through your spiritual beliefs, but that's all in your head. It's just part of your consciousness, your inner life. It's not real. Economic estrangement, he says, is that of real life. Its transcendence, therefore, embraces both aspects. So when you have economic transcendence of private property, aka you become a communist, you also leave behind religion, which was the point from the Communist Manifesto that he wrote 4 years later. It is evident, he tells us, that the initial stage of the movement amongst the various peoples depends on whether the true recognized life of the people manifests itself more in consciousness or in the external world, is more ideal or real. Communism begins from the outset with atheism because this is where we started, right? So the first thing from EPM, communism begins from the outset with atheism, but atheism is at first far from being communism. Indeed, that atheism is still mostly an abstraction. That's how this finishes. That's where we began. And so what he's saying is, look, you can look at the world through your idealistic religious worldview lens, or you can look at it as it really is through this materialist lens that he's offering, which is a socio-gnostic misinterpretation of economic conditions as the fundamental estrangement of man, organized in a form of perpetual class conflict that defines history, where history defines who you are in the first place, which he then says, of course, like I said, mentioned in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which we're not going to read from, that you make history, just not under conditions of your own choosing. His argument there is that the revolutions of the 19th century, as he phrases it, so the socialist and communist revolutions, are trying to take inspiration from the intended end point of history, which is a return to communism, return to a socialist order, return to a socialist identity and belief system, so that they can bring humanity to where it was always supposed to be. And that's the religion of communism regarding history. History doesn't just have an ongoing sentence that keeps getting written. Eventually, it's, and I realized I was a communist. And we brought the kingdom of God into being on earth as communism. Period. The end. Actually, not the end, as he points out soon. So this is the religion of communism. So what you got to do is clear out those other religions, so you can have a bare field, so you can plant the religion of communism in its place by getting people to analyze through the Marxist lens the so-called real conditions of their socio-economic determined lives as beings within the current of history, which is man's story about himself and which has a point, which is to get to the eschaton and beyond it into a perfect stateless, classless society of communism. And there it's why he brings up the philanthropy to round out the quote. The philanthropy of atheism is therefore at first only philosophical, abstract philanthropy. You might care about other people as an atheist, but it's not because you've realized you're a socialist yet. It's only abstract. It's only when you truly realize burning in your soul that you are and always were a socialist that you will have true philanthropy and truly live for each other. And he says, and that of communism is at once real and directly bent on action, which is to bring about the communist project. So the communist article of faith, which we will come back to at the end, is in fact that you believe that by awakening to this view of the world and enacting its religion, that communism will arrive. That's it. So that's the communist religion. Is it atheist? Well, it doesn't believe necessarily in God, except that it believes that mankind as a collective always was its own God. And I'm not going to go into the big details. I'm actually literally skipping this part. This is the part I'm skipping to go a couple pages down in EPM. But that's what Marx lays out, is that man is his own creator, and he needs to recognize himself as his own creator. And when he does, that becomes the genesis or birth act of communism, as when man recognizes himself as he is, as his own creator, which is to say, as his own God, and as he put it in another place, which we'll read shortly, as the true sun around which he must revolve in place of the false sun of religion or God. And so there's this kind of a few pages of waffling. It's the very famous part where Eric Fogelheim called him an intellectual swindler, where he does the whole infinite regress of ancestry. Well, where did you come from? Well, you came from men. You came from your parents, mother and father. Well, where do they come from? Well, they came from men too, their parents. Well, where do they come from? They came from men too, their parents. And then he finally gets to the point where he's like, well, yeah, I get that. He's having this imaginary conversation, like a Socratic dialogue with an imaginary questioner. And it's like, yeah, I get that. But where did the first people come from? And Marx flips out and says, don't ask me. Give up your question and you give up your abstraction, and throws this huge fit. And he calls the guy, the imaginary guy, an egoist, I think. Are you such an egoist that you think that, whatever? And so anyway, he can't answer that question. He has no account for the original origin of man. Man for Marx actually is the child of history. So for Marx, man is the estranged being that arrives when private property enters, and the kind of high spiritual man is the thing we're trying to get back to. This is what I've called in other podcasts the alpha and the omega man. So alpha man has to be dialectically synthesized with omega man. The man at the beginning of history and the man at the end of history have to become the same character. So man becomes the alpha and the omega, and once again you have the man as God motif at the heart of communism. But then he elaborates on his view of atheism in this kind of awkward wall of text. He says, but for the socialist man, the entire so-called history of the world is nothing. So the socialist man is what you become when you awaken to the communist religion, when you adopt it, when that crop begins to grow in your cleared field. So, but since for the socialist man, the entire so-called history of the world is nothing but the creation of man through human labor. See what I just told you a minute ago? Nothing but the emergence of nature for man. So he has the visible, irrefutable proof of his birth through himself, of his genesis. So that's his answer to the infinite regress. Man created himself through his own labor. Since the real existence of man and nature has become evident in practice through sense experience, because man has thus become evident for man as the being of nature, and nature for man as the being of man, the question about an alien being, meaning God, about a being above nature in man, a question which implies the admission of the unreality of nature and man. That's the Gnostic interpretation of the material world, by the way, is that it is a fallen, false reality that denies our true spiritual view. This, he says, has become impossible in practice. That's what the point of the communist religion is. Atheism, he says, as the denial of this unreality, has no longer any meaning. For atheism is a negation of God and postulates the existence of man through this negation. So atheism is the first step you take to allow your gnosis, your awakening to this Gnostic view. But what you have, because you have to get rid of the idea that you're actually alienated by a superior being, so you can realize you're actually being alienated by yourself and other men through your wrong beliefs. And that's what he means to wake up to being a socialist. He says, but socialism, as socialism, no longer stands in any need of such a mediation. It proceeds from the theoretically and practically sensuous consciousness of man and nature as the essence. Socialism is man's positive self-consciousness, no longer mediated through the abolition of religion. So socialism goes way beyond atheism. You get rid of the God belief, but there's way more to do. It's your positive self-consciousness no longer mediated through the abolition of religion. You're way beyond that. You're not just saying, oh, wow, I exist as a man, not as a child of God because there is no God. You're now having to, which is an atheist position, you're now saying, holy crap, where I actually came from is man. Man made man through his labor, and our labor is communal, and that's who I am. So it's way different. You don't need to have I don't have a God. You have I'm my own God, or mankind is its own God in place of that. So socialism is man's positive self-consciousness, no longer mediated through the abolition of religion, just as real life is man's positive reality, no longer mediated through the abolition of private property through communism. Communism is the position as the negation of the negation, and is hence the actual phase necessary for the next stage of historical development in the process of human emancipation and rehabilitation. That's a lot in that very important sentence, but I'll finish the paragraph and we'll come back to that. Communism, he says, is the necessary form and the dynamic principle of the immediate future, but communism as such is not the goal of human development, the form of human society. So that communism is not actually the end. Communism is the beginning of the next stage in human development. This, whether we're talking about the UN's weird, we're going to seize control of evolution, as I've talked about in a number of podcasts about their theosophical views, whether we're talking about the goals of the fascists, as I have revealed reading Mein Kampf and Mussolini, to bring man to his next level of existence. Communism has the same progressive goal. Progressivism is not about progressing society in material ways. That's a cover, an exoteric cover. Progressivism has an esoteric intention to advance man through his next stage of evolution, which begins with becoming socialist and enacting communism. Okay, though, let's go back to the communism as the position as the negation of the negation. So what does that mean? So negation is that dialectical process, right? You have abstract, negative, concrete. Okay, so the negation here of religion was atheism. So communism is the negation of the negation. In other words, in the sense that the same way that atheism is the negation of religion or belief in God, communism is the negation of atheism. So to say that communism is atheistic is somehow badly wrong. It is something completely different. It is the negation of atheism, where atheism is the negation of belief in God. And that's what I'm trying to communicate to you, is very hard to get across, that mankind as a collective, as a communist collective, becomes his own God, who can then direct his own future evolution. That's the negation of the negation. So the negation is belief in God. The negation of the negation, so the negation of belief in God, right? The negation of atheism is believing you're your own God, but not you individually, you egotist. Not you, us, all of us. That's communism as a religion. That when we get rid of God and get him out of the way, that's not enough. That's a bare field. You have to grow the crop. And when you negate the idea of there being nothing, when you abandon the so-called nihilism of atheism, the abstract philanthropy of atheism, when you abandon that and replace it with the hope of communism and the faith of communism, then you've arrived at something. And the realization that does that is that you, man, are socialist man, and socialist man is a species being. That means every man who's alive is a species being, which means a person or an entity or a being that works for the entire species, and in fact, as he says repeatedly, all of nature. So you become this, rather than selfish, inwardly focused person worried about the ability to exclude people from your individual private property, you become this outwardly focused world builder who is going to, with everybody else, share everything you have and build the ideal world or heaven. But it's not the last stage, he says, right? He says it is hence the actual phase necessary for the next stage of historical development. If we were talking about Helena Blavatsky, who came later than this, we would say it's the advancement from the Aryan fifth root race to the sixth root race, which is the Aquarian or the socialist. But it's just the next stage. There's one after that, and one after that, and one after that, until we finally reach what Pierre Teilhard de Chardin called the Omega point, the ultimate liberation of man at the end of history. So he says it's just communism is hence the actual phase necessary for the next stage of historical development in the process of human emancipation and rehabilitation, because communism is the necessary form and the dynamic principle. That we're all one is the dynamic principle. That's communism. We're all one. So this is that oneness religion, the necessary form of the dynamic principle of the immediate future. So the next stage, the age of Aquarius, I guess. But communism as such, he says, is not the goal of human development, the form of human society. The actual goal long-term that communism could play a role in is to escape this stupid, limited material world entirely and realize our full spiritual potential. He elaborates on these ideas a little further down, actually quite a bit further down, by going after Hegel. He likes to criticize Hegel. He uses Hegel a lot, so you have to remember that the critiques here very frequently pick up the tools and the tactics, let's say, of the people, but not necessarily their specific goals. So they import all the evil, but they get rid of the specific articulation. And in this case, Hegel was very theologically confused, I guess. I'm trying to figure out the right word. I was going to say theologically grounded, but that's not right. Hegel banged his socio-gnostic mysticism into the shape of Christian theology, which is something a little bit different. He created a heresy. So Hegel is a grotesque Christian heretic, but Marx picks up his heresy, runs with its essential core, while getting rid of what he called its superstitious natures and the theology. And so he criticizes Hegel to make his point a little further down in EPM. He says, "It is now time to formulate the positive aspects of the Hegelian dialectic within the realm of estrangement." Remember, we just talked about that. And this is a little complicated, unfortunately, because I'm skipping a big discussion about Hegel and supersession and the concept of basically Aufheben, the idea of moving around to supersede is to leave something behind, but to come back to it in a sense in a higher level of understanding. And so the whole point is that stage after stage after stage of development occurs through supersession. You think of each small thing as embedded within some bigger thing that you can understand, and you're going to supersede and supersede and supersede and supersede your way up until you finally, as Hegel had it, you're going to realize the totality of the all and return to complete oneness when you've superseded everything. In other words, as Charlie Kirk and I have talked about it many times, when you erase all distinctions. And Charlie's quick to point out that the Bible, because the world is a Bible and a world of distinctions. It is discernment that makes us understand, and the dialectic is a process for removing discernment, which creates the gurus who get to rule over the undiscerning masses. If you can't understand reality, so it's a template for totalitarianism. If you can't understand reality for yourself without somebody telling you what it is, because you're not able to discern differences clearly, right and wrong, good and evil, male and female, whatever it is, true and false, if you can't discern it for yourself, then you are reliant and dependent on somebody who's going to tell you what the correct interpretation is. And so the dialectic exists to remove distinctions. In other words, to remove discernment. In other words, to establish the dialectician himself as a guru with the higher understanding, the secret gnosis, to tell you how to order your life and understand your world. The example I give a lot of times is, if you teach queer theory to a child who does not understand much about the world yet, he's forming his category formation aspect of cognitive development. Male and female, adult and child are deeply rooted early categories, and the categories by which the child is later able to categorize things more and more and more carefully and in a more and more refined way. Notice what you have with cutting the world into a discernment of male versus female, and then cutting a world into a discernment of adult versus child. You have this overlap, right? You have an adult woman somehow being the same but different to a female child, right? They're the same in their femaleness, but they're different in their adult versus child. So you have all of the kind of category, you have all of the tools you need cognitively to start winnowing out discernment from that very early beginning point. So when you enter into a child and you dialectically tell him, well, some boys can be girls and some girls can be boys. It's all dependent on what's going on inside and how you feel. And don't worry, we have gender experts at the clinic, or me as your teacher or trusted adult or whatever, who can help you tell when your feelings are real and when they're not. Turns out what you're doing is you're destroying their capacity to understand the world for themselves and making them dependent upon gurus who will order their lives for them. In other words, you are setting them up to be subjects to tyrants. And what I'm saying here is that this dialectic that Marx is talking about is meant to do that. That is its purpose. And its mechanism is the supersession of distinctions. And Hegel's whole philosophy was built on this dialectical supersession process, removing one layer of distinction from the other to the other to the other till everything has no distinctions and we return to the primordial all that is God. I'm not exaggerating. That was his purpose. That is, his Hermeticism turned into a weird sociological philosophy that he called science, which will be an important point in a minute. Here's Marx criticizing the Hegelian dialectic by beginning to point out its positive aspects within the realm of estrangement, which is the consequence of private property for Marx. It says supersession as an objective movement of retracting the alienation into the self. This is the insight expressed within the estrangement concerning the appropriation of the objective essence through the supersession of its estrangement. Isn't he a good writer? Okay, hang on. Let's go backwards. Supersession, the thing that is the insight. Supersession as an objective movement of retracting the alienation into self. What does that mean? That the key insight of the dialectic, the key thing you're supposed to do to befuddle yourself, is to adopt this critical consciousness. You are alienated. There is a critical consciousness that explains your alienation through the oppressor versus oppressed dynamic and the intrinsic conflict of history and each person's role within it. It's not just oppressor versus oppressed, and everywhere that appears is therefore Marxism or woke. That's not ever what I said. It's much more complicated. So when you understand your alienation as part of an intrinsic system that's alienating you, and you retract that alienation into yourself, you realize yourself as the alienated being who's been alienated by the oppressive alien. That supersession as an objective moment of retracting the alienation into the self is your moment of going woke. That is your woke awakening right there. And he says, this is the insight. You identify with your alienation. Therefore, you identify with your oppression, and you therefore supersede yourself as an individual and recognize yourself as a member of the oppressed class. That is woke. Do you understand? It is not something different. That is critical consciousness. Let me say it again. You have to supersede yourself. This is why it's always identity politics. You have to supersede yourself by retracting your alienation into yourself. So seeing yourself as the oppressed victim who is oppressed by virtue of the fact that your entire class is oppressed. And when you understand yourself intrinsically as the oppressed victim, by retracting your alienation to self, you supersede yourself by understanding yourself in the class. You become an avatar of an identity, the oppressed identity. That's becoming woke. And that, he says, is the insight expressed within the Estrangement, which is what I just did for you, concerning the appropriation of the objective essence through the supersession of its estrangement. It is the estranged insight into the real objectification of man. In other words, that's the insight where you understand your real conditions. You've transformed your consciousness from seeing the world as it is to seeing the world through this critical consciousness. You've dialecticed yourself into becoming a class object. And that is the estranged insight into the real objectification of man, into the real appropriation of his objective essence. Socialist. Your real objective essence, remember, is socialist. And now you can perceive it because you've retracted your alienation into yourself and become class conscious or generalized critical conscious. That is the estranged insight into the real objectification of man, into the real appropriation of his objective essence through the annihilation of the estranged character of the objective world. So when you do this retraction, you obliterate all of the stories you've told yourself about the world. You blow out the estranged character of the objective world. You're not merely a worker. You are a part of the working class. And as a class, you are oppressed by a system. You are part of the whole cosmic movement of history. That's what I'm talking about. And he says, I got to get the flow back. It's an insanely long sentence. Into the real appropriation of his objective essence through the annihilation of the estranged character, individual, by the way, that's the estranged character. You annihilate it by seeing yourself as part of the class through the supersession of the objective world in its estranged mode of being. So you're going to blow out from or supersede or get above the objective world in its estranged mode of being, which is seeing everything as individuals, and you're going to, because of private property for him, and you're going to elevate to understanding that it's all about class and class conflict. That is called adopting a class consciousness that generalizes to critical consciousness, and in current slang that means becoming woke. That's Marx explaining the actual process of being woke. So as a diversion, what does woke left mean? It means being radically egalitarian and seeing that there are inequalities and then blaming all that on class dynamics and intrinsic class conflict. What does being woke right mean? It means believing there's an intrinsic natural hierarchy we've been alienated from, you don't get its fruits anymore. Therefore, you are an alienated class who can understand yourself as alienated by class, who blows out of the, we're just individuals doing our best, and into a collective class consciousness as an estranged, alienated class that's going to now challenge the alienating force or oppression. I know that's complicated, but please bear with me. This is one of the hardest paragraphs in this freaking book, and I'm trying to lay it out for you. He says, in the same way, atheism, I hope you just understood what I said. So now he's going to compare it to atheism. He says, in the same way, that's our point here today, atheism being the supersession of God. Okay. Atheism being the supersession of God is the advent of theoretical humanism, and communism, as the supersession of private property, is the vindication of real human life as man's possession, and thus the advent of practical humanism. Or atheism is humanism mediated with itself through the supersession of religion, whilst communism is humanism mediated with itself through the supersession of private property. Again, we have to use Hegel to understand what in the heck he's talking about, but notice that he used the same word in both cases. Atheism is the supersession of God, and that allows you, what happens when you supersede God, when you stop believing that you need God to understand the world and yourself? That's the advent of theoretical humanism. And the magic word he uses twice here is humanism. So atheism, he says, brings us into the advent, that's literally his word, of a theoretical understanding of being humanistic. In other words, humans for humans is more or less what he means by that. But it's actually also the process of humans becoming human again, which means returning to socialism. And then he says communism is the supersession of private property, and that is the advent of practical humanism. So you have the renunciation of religion, and it turns out that that is something that later communists proved didn't matter, but the renunciation of religion or of God is actually the supersession of God. In other words, you understand that humans are by us, for us, and you have the theoretical idea of having to try to make our lives better for ourselves. But when you get past private property, that's when the rubber hits the road. And that's the practical essence. So what has to happen is communism as the abolition of private property, or really the positive transcendence of private property, has to fuse with the lack of other religion, atheism, as the supersession of God, as the advent of theoretical humanism. In other words, the theoretical and the practical, just like Hegel said, are going to have to reunite and become theoretical and practical equally at the same time and in the same meaning. So what you have to do is you actually have to weld communism, the new religion, to getting rid of God so that you understand, as Marx has it in many of his writings, that there's a real world here that's not this consciousness theoretical world of religion. He says only through the supersession of this mediation, religion being the mediation, which is itself, however, a necessary premise, does positively self-deriving humanism, positive humanism come into being. But atheism, he says, and communism are no flight, no abstraction, no loss of the objective world created by man, of man's essential powers born to the realm of objectivity. They are not a returning in poverty to unnatural primitive simplicity. On the contrary, they are but the first real emergence. Notice again, it's the first step into the next stage of humanity. The first real emergence, the actual realization for man of man's essence and of his essence as something real. So atheism for communists is about getting rid of the spiritual world of the unreality, entering into the material deterministic world of sociological materialism, which is socio-gnosticism, by the way, and then using that through the communist transcendence of private property to bring man back to who he really is, the first real emergence of man's true essence, which is socialist. So way beyond being an atheist like Ayn Rand, who's a rampant individualist who didn't do it right, the point is that you have to become a socialist. So there's way more than just being an atheist. Did all that make sense? I understand it's a very hard paragraph, but you really gotta, get it to understand. And this is all about Hegel's Hermetic formula for transforming the world. And I skipped the part where he talks about supersession of this as that and the other thing and the other thing, which maybe would have made it more clear, which is Marx outlining Hegel's view of what supersession represents all the way up to the complete dissolution of all distinctions. But if we understand supersession as removing the distinctions, remember what he said, in the same way atheism being the supersession of God. So what it is removing the distinction of God versus man, which Charlie Kirk obviously pointed out is the first distinction in Genesis. It's very clear that there's a very big difference between God and man. Nope. Marx says we start by superseding that. So God and man are the same thing. And that's the advent of theoretical humanism, which is kind of a by us, for us to actualize who we really are. and then it has to be augmented through communism, which brings about man's social nature by him realizing his real conditions of exploitation, as I described in the first half of the paragraph, the awakening of class or critical consciousness, which supersedes estranged man, aka the individual, and brings him into the class-conscious man, which is the first glimpse of what it means when you understand yourself as just one part of a class in solidarity, which is collectivism, which is not the same as joining a team or voluntarily working together. Collectivism is a total ideology of belonging to a collective. The first step of collectivism is seeing yourself as a class, which is a microcosm of everybody being human in the same human class when there is otherwise stateless, classless society. Okay, so that was a lot. So let's switch over to another source from Marx, which I've read a bunch of times on here. It's another place where he talks about religion a lot, and it's the very famous Opium of the Masses essay, which is not really an essay. It is, in fact, the first page of his very long critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, which he actually wrote in the months before he wrote EPM. I don't know if he wrote it in Paris, but I assume he might have written at least some of it. The first page of that is the famous Opium, Religion is the Opium of the Masses page, and it's where he establishes that the real critique begins with the critique of religion. And so let's take a look at that together and see what he had to say. So for Germany, he begins, I'm only going to read basically 3/4 of this page. For Germany, the criticism of religion has been essentially completed, 1843, and the criticism of religion is the prerequisite of all criticism. So somehow religion gets in the way of being honest in the critical sense, or having a critical consciousness of your society. That's his thesis. He says the profane existence of error is compromised as soon as its heavenly oratio pro eris et phosis, in other words, speech for the altars and hearths, has been refuted. So the profane existence of error is compromised as soon as its heavenly speech for the altars and hearths has been refuted. Profane existence of error. So you have a world and it's filled with error that needs critique, and you can't deal with the profane versus the sublime, by the way, which means we're dealing with something Gnostic in all likelihood. This profane existence of error is compromised, he says, as soon as its heavenly speech for the altars and the hearths has been refuted. Man, who has found only the reflection of himself in the fantastic reality of heaven, where he sought a superman, Übermensch, will no longer feel disposed to find the mere appearance of himself, the non-man, or unman actually, or I guess unhuman, Unmensch, where he seeks and must seek his true reality. So his argument here is that man, in looking to himself in heaven, or as an image of God, or image bearer of God, where he seeks a superman, namely God or Christ, will no longer feel, when he believes that, you'll no longer feel disposed to find your material life in terms of its real conditions. I'm trying to figure out how to say this without adding more to it than there is. But basically, he's saying that religion gets in the way of man understanding himself as a creature in the real world. Instead, you see yourself as a spiritual being living in the real world with spiritual commitments that supersede your commitments in the real world, and beliefs in things like providence that prevent you from feeling like you need to act in the real world to deal with your so-called true reality, which is here in the real world. Again, that materialism, not just being the philosophical materialism or metaphysical materialism, but also sociological materialism that we discussed previously. The foundation of irreligious criticism, he says, is man makes religion. Religion does not make man. Religion is indeed the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has either not yet won through to himself or has already lost himself again. So I want you to go back to thinking of that analogy to the field. So religion is what's growing there before it's plowed, And you want to grow the communist crop, so man realizes himself as socialist through the communist examination of his so-called real conditions. Religion is the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has either not yet won through to himself or has already lost himself again. So the true crop isn't able to grow because the false crop is in the way. And maybe you never got to where you understand reality or can see reality because you're religious. Or maybe you did and you fell back into faith, and faith is now in the way of you growing that other crop. He says, but man is no abstract being squatting outside the world. Man is the world of man, which is his state and society. So man is no abstract being squatting outside the world. Okay, fine, we live in the world. Man is the world of man. So man is his own world, and it's presented in state and society. This is why I argue that the three pieces of the Marxist trinity, if we were to adopt the dialectical trinity of Hegel, which I talked about in those previous lectures I gave at detail, would be man, state, and society. This state and this society, he says, produce religion, which is an inverted consciousness of the world because they are in an inverted world. Religion is the general theory of this world. It's encyclopedic compendium. It's the explanation for everything in the world. It's logic in popular form. It's spiritual point d'honneur. It's enthusiasm. It's moral sanction. It's solemn compliment. And its universal basis of consolation and justification. It is the fantastic realization of the human essence. Fantastic here doesn't mean great. It means fantasy, okay? It is the fantastic realization, the fantasy realization of the human essence, since the human essence has not acquired any true reality. So Marx is saying that here's how, religion works. It kind of answers every question. It means everything to people. It's basically a great meaning-making structure. That's the grass in your field before your farm. And it's an illusion. It's inverted. It's not real. It's a fantasy. It's the fantastic realization of the human essence. And the reason you have to have a fantastic realization of who we are as humans is because we haven't been willing to go to the real reality, the true reality of what it means to be human. He says the struggle against religion is therefore indirectly the struggle against that world whose spiritual aroma is religion. And so the struggle against religion is, in a sense, the struggle against the conditions of the world that create the need for the belief in religion. In other words, all estrangement, alienation, suffering, and so on. So what he's saying is that we really suffer, but we don't recognize that we suffer. We haven't adopted that oppressed mindset and superseded our conditions by retracting it into ourselves, because the world provides us with all this religious belief that allows us to justify. It's the universal basis of consolation and justification that allows us to justify why the world is the way it is. So if we're going to struggle against religion, he says, what we actually have to do is struggle against what makes us need religion in the first place. So he says religious suffering, and that would be the real project. That's what communism is supposed to do. But you're not going to, his purpose here, and what I'm going to get to, is that you won't engage in communism as long as you have religion. So you have to get that other religion out of the way, plow the field so you can grow the communist crop. As long as there's something else there, you won't engage in the communist thing. You won't engage in understanding, as he would have it, in transforming your reality. Religious suffering, he says, is at one and the same time. This is the paragraph, by the way, that everybody knows, or the end of it. Religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion, this is some actually decent writing, I'll give him props. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. So that's the famous line, right? Okay, so you're oppressed, and rather than do something about it, you sigh. That's religion. It's just the way it is. God carry us, or whatever. God make my enemies ridiculous. And boy, does he answer that prayer. It's the heart of the heartless world. The world is heartless and exploitative and brutal and alienating and all of the estranging and all of these terrible things. Heartless. It doesn't care about you, but religion makes you believe it does. It is the soul of soulless conditions. The conditions we find ourselves in class conflict are evil. They are soulless. They are cruel. They are not good. But religion gives it a false soul. It is the opium of the people, and opium is not a painkiller, contrary to popular belief. It is a numbing agent in the mind. You still have all your pain, you just don't care that you have your pain. So religious suffering, you have all your pain, but you don't care, is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. So Karl makes sense. That's some pretty poetic writing. I'll give him credit for that. But what he's saying is that religion is in the way of people apprehending that they are in bad conditions and should do something about it. It is the grass growing in the field that prevents you from planting crops by plowing it away first. Actually, I should say it prevents you from planting crops. So if you want to become a communist and deal with your real conditions as he sees it, you've got to plow it first. And that's becoming an atheist. The abolition of religion, he says, as the illusory happiness of the people. So religion is the illusory happiness of the people. That's the embedded supposition here. That's the premise. Religion is the illusory happiness of the people. You suffer, but you're happy about it, to use the Harry Potter line. That's fake happiness. You're not really happy. You're actually miserable. But religion lets you paper it over with the numbing effects of opium. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. So his point here is the second we get the opium out of the way, people are going to be like, oh my God, my life sucks. I've hit rock bottom. I need to do something about it. To call on them, Marx says, to give up their illusions about their condition. So you have a bunch of illusions that your religion provides for you about how bad your life is. So we're going to get rid of those. So to call on you to give up those illusions about your condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. So if I can get you to throw away the crack pipe, or really the opium pipe in this case, the religion, and the illusions that it gives you about your actual miserable conditions, your soulless world, your heartless world, and all of this, soulless conditions and heartless world, if I get you to give up all your illusions about that, then that's actually calling you to say, why don't we just change the world? Because we can get rid of the conditions that we're in that require us to pray to God and be grateful for what little we have. We could have more, and we don't have to be grateful. The criticism of religion, he says, is therefore in embryo, so it's the earliest beginning. The criticism of that veil of tears, that's veil, V-A-L-E, like in a forest, not like you would wear over your face. The criticism of that veil of tears, of which religion is the halo. So we live in this miserable world, the veil of tears. Religion is this halo over it that gives it a false glow. And criticism of religion is the very beginning, he's saying, of the criticism of why we're in a veil of tears in the first place. The soulless conditions and heartless world, the so-called real conditions we find ourselves in. He elaborates poetically a little bit more. And this is the last paragraph. I'll read from this. Criticism has plucked the imaginary flowers on the chain. So religion is a bunch of imaginary flowers on the chain of being of history, and it is plucked. Criticism is going to take out the imaginary flowers, not in order that man shall continue to bear that chain without fantasy or consolation. So it's not you're wearing the chains of existence. Again, this is extremely Gnostic, and it has all these false flowers in it of religion. So criticism comes along and plucks out all the flowers, all the things that hide from your eyes how bad it really is. But you're not doing it, he says, so that man will continue to bear the chain without fantasies or consolation. The goal isn't to keep wearing the chain at all, is what Marx is going to say. And so it's not that, can you picture what he's talking about? You are suffering, you're in chains, but your chains are decorated with nice things, flowers, as he puts it. And we're going to pluck away all the flowers so that you can recognize that you're in chains. But he says that the point isn't that you're going to continue to bear the chain just without flowers on it. He says, but instead so that he shall throw off the chain and pluck the living flower. So the point is to get you to recognize that you're in miserable chained conditions, Gnostic imprisonment, so that you will throw off the chain and pluck the living flower. In other words, so that you will return to life. This is very, very Gnostic. The criticism of religion, he says, disillusions man. That doesn't mean makes you miserable. That's not what disillusionment means here. It means you are under illusions about the nature of the world, and it will remove those illusions. The criticism of religion disillusions man so that he will think, act, and fashion his reality like a man who has discarded his illusions and regained his senses. So you're basically drunk on your opium, not doing anything about the bad circumstances of your life, and we're going to use criticism to get rid of that, to get rid of those so you'll regain your senses and say, holy crap, everything sucks. And I'm going to do something about it. I've regained my senses. Why are you going to do this? He says, so that he will move man, so that he will move around himself as his own true son, S-U-N, not S-O-N. So you become the central object of your own existence. That's why. Not you individually, man overall, as a collective, as a full class, as a full human class. And religion, he says, is only the illusory sun which revolves around man as long as he does not revolve around himself. So the goal is to get you to drop religion so that you will realize that this is a by us, for us situation, and we're going to revolve around ourselves as our own true sun. And as I pointed out before, I don't have 100% confirmation on this, but there's possible, if not likely, that this is a esoteric reference to Zoroastrian mysticism, which is going to get me made fun of. The woke right does not want me talking about the Zoroastrian roots of Marxism for some reason or another, so they mock me vigorously every time I bring it up, no matter how many things it shows up in. This one, I'll admit, I'm not laying it out in a concrete sense. I just suspect it. But the Zoroastrian belief is that the sun that we see in the sky during the daytime and not at night is the false sun because it appears to go around the earth and is therefore subject. But the pole star, North Star, Polaris, around which the Big Dipper rotates and the entire sky rotates each night, is secretly the true sun, which is the province of the, not exactly high god, but like the manifestation of the dialectical union of good and evil of the high god, named Mithras, is in charge of. But I'm not going to get into all this. So in other words, he's saying that, you need to realize that this religion thing kind of goes around us, right? We don't actually go around it. It goes around us. It's the false sun. The thing that everything goes around is ourselves. And I'm pretty sure that he's hearkening, can't prove it, hearkening to the Zoroastrian mysticism upon which the Manichaean cult and Sethian cult were built in the Gnostic cults of the first century. But I digress. Would Marx be aware of that esotericism? Yes, probably. Okay. So now you got the point, right? The field metaphor makes sense now, right? The problem is you have land that could be humanized. In other words, it could be made fit for human use. It could be turned into a farm, but it has other things growing on it. So you need to clear that out. But you think it's great the way that it is because of your religion. So you're going to clear out those existing religious beliefs, especially Christianity and Judaism, for very particular reasons, so that you can grow communism in the cleared field. That's the relationship. The clearing of the field is the atheism, which is merely theoretical farming, but it's practical farming when you abolish private property and plant communism in it, which becomes the positive transcendence, or in other words, a transformation of what it means to be human, which he characterizes as a complete return of man to himself, as a socialist, which is to say a human being, because non-socialists in communism are not fully human. They're denying their humanity. They are alienated and using their alienation to alienate others. Thus, they're not only victims of the Gnostic demiurge in the propertied classes, they are actually also perpetrators, thus evil, of the Gnostic alienation. They are agents of the alien who is alienating. I know this is so abstract. If you don't understand Gnosticism, it's almost impossible to communicate this to you. But this is the essence of the Marxist socio-Gnostic religion. And so man, as he truly was in his idealized form, Alpha and Omega man, is the God who's going to revolve around himself as his own true son by getting religion out of the way. And he does that by clearing the field to grow his true social or human nature back into existence. So communism deifies the collective of man as a perfectly social collective. And so is it atheist? Technically, yes, but no, because it's still got an idealistic, absolute man that lives in absolute society that is the perfect. Man just becomes his own God. Literally, his own true son that revolves around himself, that is his own creator, his own source of genesis. Okay, so now you understand the idea. The religions and the relationship of atheism to communism is that the other religions are in the way. Now, I've had this kind of pin for many paragraphs here where I said they don't actually have to do the atheism as supersession thing. And the reason is because, like I keep pointing out, they figured out how to go straight from religion to religion. They figured out how to do a straight religious conversion from Catholicism or Protestantism or whatever straight to communism. And those tools are called things like liberation theology and the social gospel. Social gospel was first written in like 1905 or 6 or 3 or something like early 1900s, first decade of the 1900s. I forget what year, 1906, 8, 4, something. I think it's one of the even numbers. I don't remember. But it's written by Walter Rauschenbusch after he went for a year and a half and studied with the Fabian socialists, Sidney and Beatrice Webb and George Bernard Shaw in London, and then came back to Hell's Kitchen as a Baptist preacher and wrote the Social Gospel. That's what it's called. You can go read it. It's literally like 1905 social justice warrior in Baptist theology. And they also used, like I said, liberation theology, which was largely a KGB creation in South America to convert the Catholic Church into a communist machine, a communist producing machine. And so they were able to subvert Catholic theology, including directly Catholic integralism, which is pretty hardcore and fairly, not perfectly, but not imperfectly connected to fascism. They're able to subvert that into communism as well. So it turns out that atheism as a supersession could also just be subverted religion as a supersession. So I hate to break it to all these badass Christians out there, Christian nationalists or whatever, banging on their chests and saying that the problem is liberalism and secularism. That's kind of Marx's argument, but it turns out in practice the communists got around that anyway. Almost all of the communism we have in the United States, all of our communist education, the Marxification of education that I wrote about in a book of that title, all of that comes from liberation theology. Paulo Freire was a liberation theologian who worked directly with Dom Elder Camara, who I already mentioned. So liberation theology became the basis for critical pedagogy. Nobody in the field hides this. This is explicit. They're very clear about it. So liberation theology got not like superficially secularized and turned into our education system, critical pedagogy, to turn all of our kids into Marxists, which is what actually generated the social justice warrior phenomenon of the last 15 years. So turns out you can go the other way. The atheism can come downstream from the religion, as it turns out. So you don't get to bang your chest and say it targets liberalism becomes communism, without also acknowledging that it can subvert Christianity to exactly the same end. It's not, I'm sorry, it is just simply not. It's just completely incorrect to say that it is liberalism and secularism that turn into communism. First of all, you have to plant the socialism and the communist ethos in that field if that's the direction. And second of all, there's a completely separate direction. You would have to, if you say that communism is the logical conclusion of secular liberalism, then you also have to say that communism is the logical conclusion of Christianity because of liberation theology, which luckily Christians tend to be discerning enough when they aren't caught up in it to know is a heresy. You could also see, if you considered liberalism as a kind of religious object, which is a category error that many of them make, woke right, I should say, make this. If you were to consider it that, actually woke left does too, if you were to consider that like a religion, communism again becomes just a heresy on that, or a heresy even on this atheism as Marx is describing it, because it's the planting of this socio-gnostic structure that makes it matter. I digress. Again, let's get to the point. One more piece from Marx. This is a piece that I'm taking some risks to read. I've never read this before. It's really rough. But where does this go? Well, the existing religions are the problem. That's where it goes. So the existing religions are Judaism and Christianity, and by far dominantly Christianity in Germany at the time when Marx is writing this stuff, which again is 1843 again. So we've done 1844, 1843, 1843. All the manifesto is 1848. So this is all 1840s, all the pieces that I'm talking about. I mentioned the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is 1852, aside from the point. So in 1843, Marx decided to tangle with the infamous Jewish question. What is the Jewish question, by the way? It's what do we do with the Jews? That's what the Jewish question is. What do we do with the Jews, right? And the answer to the Jewish question, kind of in lots of German contexts and maybe some others, tends to be get rid of them. And Hitler called the last stroke of that the final solution, right? Very infamously. So Marx in 1843 writes this essay that I've wanted to read pieces of it to you before, but it's a bit intense. I'm not sure that the censors on YouTube are going to like this. Dear YouTube censors, I'm just going to tell you, I'm reading a historical document for educational purposes. Do not put a strike on my account. Do not shut my account down for this. Anyway, I'm going to read to you from On the Jewish Question, written by Karl Marx in 1843. You're going to notice that at the beginning, it's in 2 chapters. The first chapter is much longer than the second. The second chapter you basically couldn't distinguish from Hitler. And I'm going to read to you that fun rant. But let's see where this goes. If you believe that the existing religions are the problem that prevents people from taking up communism, which is what we just heard from both EPM, which set the stage, and that what we heard from the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, which is the opium of the masses thing, which he's very clear about, then you have to figure out how to deal with the existing religions. And it turns out On the Jewish Question, this young Marx doesn't just deal with Jews, he deals with Christians too. And his answer is, big surprise, you got to get rid of them. Now again, we go back to the Communist Manifesto. He's consistent. He didn't change his mind about religion. The idea is that you get rid of religion in all of these documents so far, and in this one too. So all 4 of the documents I'm reading from, you get rid of religion by getting rid of the conditions in society that make people want to be religious. In other words, by getting rid of all of their material injustices, they will no longer be religious, which is a fundamental misunderstanding of why Christians and Jews are religious. He thinks that it's all a cope and a crutch and a little bit of opium to numb the roughness of their lives. He completely misunderstands the point of faith. He completely misunderstands the whole thing, but of course he did. Remember his religious history, where he's raised a Lutheran, turns atheist, becomes a Satanist, and channels that into communism as a new socio-Gnostic religion. By the way, Satan is the first Gnostic in a sense, and therefore, or Lucifer, and therefore you have this current is perfectly consistent thinking. So the idea of this essay is going to be, what do we do with the Jews? That's the Jewish question. The answer is we get rid of them. But he doesn't want to get rid of them like a final solution, or like Luther recommended through these weird, intense strictures, where he wrote about in his awful missive near the end of his life on the Jews and their lives, which P.S. a lot of the woke right very much like. It's like their favorite Luther thing. No, instead, he says we're going to banish the material conditions that make people need to be Jewish in the first place. And so in the process, he gets pretty nasty about the Jews. Here's what he says. And this is heavily trimmed. I'm just picking a little bit of this fairly long essay. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, obviously. He says the critique of the Jewish question. Notice that he's no longer going to directly deal with the Jewish question. He's going to critique the Jewish question, because critique is the secret formula. Critical consciousness and supersession through it is the secret formula, the gnosis that allows you to deal with the world according to Karl Marx. So the critique of the Jewish question is the answer to the Jewish question, he says. The summary, therefore, is as follows. We must emancipate ourselves before we can emancipate others. The most rigid form of the opposition between the Jew and the Christian is the religious opposition. So here's the scene. I got to set the stage a little bit for you. He's looking into here's why he's talking about the Jewish question. He's looking at Germany, and he sees the Jews are a second-class citizen group, and they are like, we want to be considered equal. We want political equality in Germany, which at that point is legally Christian, and they're all offended by this. Marx is offended by this. Bruno Bauer, who he's kind of like essay debating with, is offended by this. Oh, the Jew wants equality. Well, that's ridiculous. He can't have equality because then he's equal with the Christians and he's a Jew, so he's actually demanding something greater than equality. He says, so the most rigid form of the opposition between the Jew and the Christian is the religious opposition. How is an opposition resolved? By making it impossible. So you're not going to try to mediate. You're not going to try to find a balance. You're not going to try to negotiate. Nope, we're going to make it impossible. How is religious opposition, he asks, made impossible? By abolishing religion. So like I told you, you're going to plow the field, get rid of Judaism and Christianity both, and then you won't have this problem of the Jewish question where the Jews want political equality in a Christian country. He says, as soon as Jew and Christian recognize that their respective religions are no more than different stages in the development of the human mind, different snakeskins cast off by history. There's your Ouroboros, by the way, the snake eating its own tail. Different snakeskins cast off by history, and that man is the snake who sloughed them. The relation of the Jew and Christian is no longer religious, but it is only a critical scientific and human relation. Science then constitutes their unity, but contradictions in science are resolved by science itself. I must remind you that Marx believed that the one true science was Marxism, and that the one true science of Marxism was derived from the system of science outlined by Hegel, which is actually his mysticism, based on the snake of history shedding its own skin through consuming its own tail over and over and over again. So this is the hermetic transformation of society through one successive stage after another. What he's saying is that Jews and Christians are just two stages, Jew before Christian, as he argues. I don't know if I have that section here, but the Jews became Christians, and so the Christians were like the snake sloughing off their Jewish skin. But it's man after man after man that he says, man is the snake who sloughed them. Mankind as a society first got over Judaism and then got over Christianity, but some of the Jews are a remnant and they didn't want to come forward with Christianity, and here they are causing a problem in Germany by demanding political equality where the Christians don't want them to, and they're in this conflict. So the way that we're going to fix the conflict, he said, is by abolishing religion. And how are you going to abolish it? By making it impossible. And how are you going to, you're going to make it impossible by abolishing it. And how are you going to abolish it? By getting both Jews and Christians to realize that their religions aren't real. In fact, that they're two stages in history, and that there's a later stage, P.S., is called communism. And once that they understand that these are just stages of history, the relationship between the Jew and the Christian won't be a religious conflict any longer. Oh, you're just an earlier stage than I'm in. Oh, you're just later stage. Okay. But then it'll just be critical and scientific in terms of the science of history that Marxism defined itself as, and a matter of human relation. In other words, you're going to be on the socialist path to understanding one another and get to unity. And how? Through science itself, in other words, through Marxism and Hegelian dialectics. So he goes on, I'm skipping some paragraphs here. He says the political emancipation of the Jew, so that's the wanting political equality, the political emancipation of the Jew, the Christian, and in general of religious man is the emancipation of the state from Judaism, from Christianity, from religion in general. So if you want Christians, Jews, and religious people to be free and equal, you've got to get rid of Judaism, Christianity, and religion in the state. So you need a completely secular state. He says in its own form, but the relationship between secularism and what he's talking about, by the way, is the same as what he said about atheism and communism. Secularism's just kind of a false start. It doesn't even start to get there. It's abstract. He says, in its own form, in the manner characteristic of its nature, the state as a state emancipates itself from religion by emancipating itself from the state religion. That is to say, by the state as a state not professing any religion, but on the contrary, asserting itself as a state. So the state should go religiously neutral. Remember, this is 1843 in Germany. The United States has already been in this situation for many decades, 6, 7 decades. The political emancipation from religion, he says, is not a religious emancipation that has been carried through to completion and is free from contradiction, because political emancipation is not a form of human emancipation which has been carried through to completion. That's communism, by the way, where everybody's equal, and is free from contradiction. So what he's saying is, okay, so if you want to start this process of political emancipation from religion, you become a secular state, okay? And a lot of the religious people out there are like, aha, Lindsay, you're wrong. Once again, you're wrong. Here he is. He's saying secularism is the beginning stage, and it doesn't have to go that way. Turns out the United States is running an experiment with religious plurality, including Jews, which were acknowledged from the very beginning by our founding fathers, and Christians working and living in harmony as individuals who can have mutual respect and work together without hating each other, without setting up any religious obstacles. And that's why state after state after state after state after state abandoned their individual state religions, which are not prohibited explicitly by the early Constitution. So each state eventually got rid of its own state religion. And the reason is because it turns out you can actually have more than one religion in a society working together by allowing people to have religious freedom entirely. You do not have to go communist because of this. The United States was founded on the idea that no, you don't have to go communist because of this, because we're going to focus on people's individual rights of conscience to believe as they will, including forming voluntary faith communities called churches or synagogues or whatever else that may not be voluntary to the members who have voluntarily signed up to them after they're in them. Although they still are. You can still quit, and the law isn't going to fool with you. But anyway, his point is that the political emancipation from religion. So we make the secular state, he's like, that's not going to resolve all the contradictions. And the reason is because everybody's still going to, or lots of people, not everybody, are still going to be religious, and they disagree with each other. So until we get to a deeper level of emancipation from religion, which is the one that we've been discussing through this entire podcast, the socialist one, by plowing the field and replacing it with socialism, a new religion for everybody to worship at, until we get to that point, well, there's still going to be contradictions. And only when you get to human emancipation, aka communism, are you going to have a complete emancipation that is free from contradiction. So, okay, you set up your secular state, there's still going to be religious conflict, is what Marx is saying. It's not going to be enough. It's not going to solve the Jewish question because you're still going to have Jews, and that's going to be the problem. And you're still going to have Christians, and their opposition is still going to exist, and you're going to have atheists mixed in, and their oppositions are going to exist, and so on and so forth. Later down, he says, it's possible, therefore, for the state to have emancipated itself from religion, even if the overwhelming majority is still religious. So that's what I was saying. Most people in a secular state will still be religious, but not by state compulsion, but rather by voluntary belief. This isn't good enough for Marx because you still have the religion. There's still stuff growing on the field. You can't plant the communist crop there in his belief. And the overwhelming majority, he tells us, does not cease to be religious through being religious in private, but the attitude of the state and of the republic, or a free state in particular, to religion is, after all, only the attitude to religion of the men who compose the state. Further down, man, as the adherent of a particular religion, finds himself in conflict with his citizenship and with other men as members of the community. So because you're a member of a religion, you're going to put your faith ahead of the state sometimes, his citizenship, and you're going to have conflicts, religion to religion, with other men. Now, the point of classical liberalism was to facilitate the ability to have those conflicts without violence and to allow the pluralism, the religious pluralism, for people to believe as they will and interact economically and politically as friends and neighbors despite the differences. And that the citizenship requirement in the United States is based off of the idea that you maintain this capacity for that plurality, rather than descending into conflict. And if you're going to have conflict between religions, as the Catholics and Protestants, or the Jews and Christians, or any two denominations of Protestants will, you're going to settle them by discussion and debate, which can be done actually as friends and compatriots in the project of a broader pluralistic community. That was the American experiment with regard to belief, because they believed that the state had no business whatsoever dictating somebody's conscience to them if they are free men. Well, Karl Marx says that's not good enough. You're still going to have people in contradiction with one another. They're not all going to be socialists. In other words, you're going to have to get rid of their religions in order to grow a new one that binds them all in the direction of socialism, which he believes is their true human nature that they're estranged from, as we've heard all along. He says this conflict reduces itself to the secular division between the political state and civil society. This secular conflict, to which the Jewish question ultimately reduces itself, the relation between the political state and its preconditions. Sometimes he writes things that don't look like sentences until way later. I'm looking for the verb. I'm just going to do it again, and we're just going to go. I don't know where the verb is. The secular conflict to which the Jewish question ultimately reduces itself, the relationship between the political state and its preconditions, whether these are material elements such as private property, etc., or spiritual elements such as the culture of religion, the conflict between the general interest and private interest, the schism between the political state and civil society. I guess there's an is in there somewhere. We'll put it, the secular conflict is what the Jewish question ultimately reduces itself to. Okay, good enough. He says political emancipation, a little further down, is of course a big step forward. So making a secular state is a big step forward in getting free of religion and solving the Jewish question. True, it is not the final form of human emancipation in general, but it is the final form of human emancipation within the hitherto existing world order. So as long as we're trapped within the status quo of class society, secularism is a big step forward, he says. It's not the final emancipation, but it is as good as we can do within class society. But there's obviously, in his view, something better. So getting the state out of the way allows people to, I was going to say clear the field to grow communism, but it's not even that, because you don't break free of the existing status quo here at all. There's no plowing of the field. I don't know what the metaphor is, and I'm not going to stretch it to try to figure it out. It goes without saying, he says, that we are speaking here of real, practical emancipation. In other words, legal equality and to a degree social equality. He says, man emancipates himself politically from religion by banishing it from the sphere of public law to that of private law. Religion is no longer the spirit of the state in which man behaves, although in a limited way, in a particular form, and in a particular sphere. This is grammar that doesn't read well, that doesn't read out loud well. It doesn't speak well. So I'm going to take out the part that was in dashes, which is although in a limited way, in a particular form, and in a particular sphere. But I'm just going to read the sentence without that. Religion is no longer the spirit of the state in which man behaves as a species being in community with other men. So religion allows him, what the parentheses or the parenthetical part dashed off means, is that religion allows men to pretend kind of in a limited way, in a particular form, in a particular sphere, act as species beings, in other words, communists, but not totally, not within the community of other men. Religion, he says, has become the spirit of civil society, of the sphere of egoism, of bellum omnium contra omnis, in other words, war of all against all. It is no longer the essence of community. This is what happens when you have what religion is in the secular state. It's war of all against all. It is no longer the essence of community, because before, in a limited way, religion let you pretend you were doing the communist thing. It bound you together. This is actually the woke right argument. But once you go secular, it doesn't do that anymore. That's also the woke right argument, by the way. And what the woke right conclude is the same thing Karl Marx says. It is no longer the essence of community, but the essence of difference. So once you secularize, you're not binding everybody together through the law, making them all believe the same religion, which approximates the species being aspect in a limited form. Now you're allowing them to be at odds with one another over religion. And so it's no longer the sense of what binds a community. It's now an essence of difference. And again, this is the woke right argument that they give, which is where they say that Karl Marx had good arguments against things like secularism, liberalism, and capitalism. He says it has become the expression of man's separation from his community. So there's the broader community, which is secular and multi-religious. And so, say the Jews are off in their own Jewish areas, and the Christians are off doing their own Christian thing, and they can't see eye to eye very well. They are now different from each other and separated from each other. They are the expression of man's separation from his community, from himself, and from other men, as it was originally. It is only the abstract avowal of specific perversity, private whimsy, and arbitrariness. The endless fragmentation of religion in North America, for example, gives it even externally the form of a purely individual affair. It has been thrust among the multitude of private interests and ejected from the community as such. Once again, we are rehashing pieces of the woke right argument against secularism here. This is arguably where they got it. But one should be under no illusion about the limits of political emancipation, the division of the human being into a public man and a private man, the displacement of religion from the state into civil society. This is not a stage of political emancipation, but its completion. This emancipation, therefore, neither abolished the real religiousness of man nor strives to do so. Did you hear that one part woke right, though? This doesn't get rid of people being religious. Secularism still allows people to be religious, in particular in the United States, where he says it even fractures down to the individual. The religious spirit, therefore, Marx complains, is still not really secularized. But furthermore, the religious spirit cannot really be secularized. So he says, making the state secular cannot make people secular, or non-religious, actually. Furthermore, the religious spirit cannot really be secularized, for what is it in itself but the non-secular form of a stage in the development of the human mind? The religious spirit can only be secularized insofar as the stage of development of the human mind, of which it is the religious expression, makes its appearance and becomes constituted in its secular form. This takes place in the democratic state. Not Christianity, but the human basis of Christianity is the basis of this state. Religion remains the ideal non-secular consciousness of its members because religion is the ideal form of the stage of development achieved in this state. Again, this is a very close to woke right argument here. And so, skipping down a little bit, he explains what political emancipation from religion, in other words, a secular state, achieves. He says, we have thus shown, and I've skipped a lot of him squabbling with Bauer in text, we have thus shown that political emancipation from religion leaves religion in existence, although not a privileged religion. The contradiction in which the adherent of a particular religion finds himself involved in relation to his citizenship is only one aspect of the universal secular contradiction between the political state and civil society. So if we're not all of one religion, there's a contradiction between public life and private life, or political state and civil society. There's a contradiction there that's not resolved. Marx's solution is we're going to get all the other religions out of the way, even in a secular state, and we're going to replace them with one belief system, which is socialism, that will overcome them all. That's why he says the solution to the Jewish question is to get rid of the Jews and the Christians and the religious man in general. So the consummation of the Christian state, he says, is the state which acknowledges itself as a state and disregards the religion of its members. So the logical conclusion of Christianity is secularism, is actually what he just said there. The emancipation of the state from religion is not the emancipation of the real man from religion. So therefore, for Marx, it's inadequate. Therefore, he says, we do not say to the Jews as Bauer does, you cannot be emancipated politically without emancipating yourselves radically from Judaism. On the contrary, we tell them, because you can be emancipated politically without renouncing Judaism completely and incontrovertibly, political emancipation itself is not human emancipation. If you Jews, he says, want to be emancipated politically without emancipating yourselves humanly, that means becoming communist, by the way, the half-hearted approach and contradiction is not in you alone. It is inherent in the nature and category of political emancipation. In other words, what he's done is turn this whole thing into a critique of secularism itself as an inadequate way to organize a society, one that cannot actually solve the Jewish question, which is, again, what do we do with the Jews? So he gives a fairly long discussion after this about how what you end up with is an egoistic, in other words, non-communist, but an egoistic individual out of man, rather than reharmonizing him into a complete socialistic species being. And then he concludes this first section of the essay after that complaint in this way. Only when the real individual man reabsorbs himself in the abstract citizen, remember that alienation reabsorbing itself into the self? Your alienation is going to retract into the self as supersession. Only when the real individual man reabsorbs himself in the abstract citizen and as an individual human being has become a species being in his everyday life, that means a socialist, in his particular work, in his particular situation, only when man has recognized and organized his own powers as social powers socialism, and consequently no longer separates social power, class conflict, from himself in the shape of political power, only then will human emancipation have been accomplished. Period. So that's how he ends the first part of this essay. And all it means is that getting rid of a state religion and going secular doesn't solve the conflict of religion in society, therefore doesn't solve the Jewish question or answer the Jewish question. The only thing that could is becoming a socialist, or actually a communist. And doing that requires getting rid of individual religion, not just state religion at all levels. Because otherwise, your faith can still be personal and you're still attached to a kind of individualism and even voluntary communalism in your faith, rather than uniting as a total society in a religion of communism. So we're back to, if you want to be able to grow a communist society successfully, which is what he says is the entire point of history in which man is part, you have to plow the field of all existing religions so that you can have fertile ground to grow, bare fertile ground to grow communism in. So then he gets to the second part of this essay, which is pretty short, positively bonkers, and reads a lot more like Hitler than it does to Marx, unless you're really familiar with how much Marx, turns out, wasn't Jewish. Marx didn't like Jews, guys. Marx didn't like Jews. Jews represented people who were stubbornly attached to a religion that wasn't communism. Marx says what I'm about to read to you about Jews because Jews wouldn't become communist because they're Jews. Now, if communism is Jewish, that doesn't make any sense. But it makes the arch-communist made this argument because communism isn't Jewish. Communism is anti-Jewish, and I mean that in every way. The opposite of Judaism, the negation of Judaism, in fact, the negation of Judaism, as we already heard, and against Judaism directly. Okay. Here's what he has to say, and this is the big risks. Please don't cancel my YouTube. Karl Marx says, I'll try to be very clear about, Karl Marx says over and over and over again here, we are trying to break with the theological formulation of the question. For us, the question of the Jew's capacity for emancipation becomes the question, what particular social element has to be overcome in order to abolish Judaism? Remember the previous discussion from, say, the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. There are conditions underlying society that people adopt religion to anesthetize themselves to. They don't want to deal with the challenges of their life. They want to put a false heart and a false soul in an awful condition. So what particular social element has to be overcome? What do we have to do to transform society in order to abolish Judaism? This doesn't mean by chasing them out with guns, by the way. It doesn't mean putting them in concentration camps, except that's what the communists did in practice when they wouldn't renounce their faith. It doesn't mean doing what the Nazis did with ghettos. What it means is that they're going to transform the society so that the underlying material conditions that make them need to use Judaism as a medicine or a crutch will go away and they'll stop being Jews. That's what Marx's fantasy is, because he doesn't understand why Jews are Jews. He doesn't understand the covenantal relationship that they feel that they have with their God and that what that represents to them as a people. Instead, nope, it's just an outgrowth of having bad material conditions that they need to try to figure out. That's what he keeps meaning by different stages of the mind and historical development. Here's his answer. For the present day, Jews' capacity for emancipation is the relation of Judaism to the emancipation of the modern world. This relation necessarily results from the special position of Judaism in the contemporary enslaved world. Let us consider the actual worldly Jew, not the Sabbath Jew as Bauer does, but the everyday Jew. You can tell this is about to get very Hitlerish. Let us not look for the secret of the Jew in his religion. So it's not about his religion. Remember, it's all about the material conditions. Religion is just this false thing people make up to have opium about the bad conditions they're in. So let us not look, he says, for the secret of the Jew in his religion, but let us look for the secret of his religion in the real Jew. So we're going to secularize the Jew, pretend he's not religious, look at how he behaves, find out what that tells us from the communist perspective, what his conditions must be, and figure out why he is as he is. Again, no idea of the covenantal relationship that Jews believe that they share with their God. No, let us not look there for the secret of the Jew in his religion. Let's not believe that he's actually religious, but let us look for the secret of his religion in the real Jew. What is the secular basis of Judaism, he says. Notice how you're already asking the wrong question, but he believes that that's how you're going to solve it because everything's got to be material and these spiritual concerns are just out there. So what is the secular basis of Judaism? Marx asks. Great answer he gives. Practical need, self-interest. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. How about that? Well, very well then. Emancipation from huckstering and money, consequently from practical real Judaism, would be the self-emancipation of our time. That's Marx's conclusion. So if we could get rid of money, there would be no huckstering, and if there was no huckstering, the Jew couldn't be Jewish, so he would be emancipated from Judaism and you wouldn't have any problem. Got it? His God is money, not the thing he's in covenantal relationship with, and therefore his practice, his religious practice, is huckstering. So if we get rid of the need for money by being communist, we get rid of the need to be a Jew, and he won't be Jewish anymore. That's literally Marx's argument, his answer to the Jewish question. An organization of society, he says, which would abolish the preconditions for huckstering, and therefore the possibility of huckstering, would make the Jew impossible. Sounds exactly like Hitler. His religious consciousness would be dissipated like a thin haze in the real vital air of society. See how this links up with his earlier stuff that I read to you? On the other hand, if the Jew recognizes that, remember what it said in the Communist Manifesto, that it would be the other religions unnecessary if we were all communist? That's what he's saying here. If we made our society communist, it would abolish the preconditions for huckstering, and therefore the possibility of huckstering, which would make the Jew impossible. His religious consciousness would be dissipated like a thin haze in the real vital air of society. There's your false flowers coming off with the chain getting thrown off. On the other hand, if the Jew recognizes that this practical nature of his is futile and works to abolish it, he extricates himself from his previous development and works for human emancipation as such, and turns against the supreme practical expression of human self-estrangement. So the way that the Jew becomes a communist is by stop being a Jew. Remember, guys, that the claim people believe is that communism is Jewish. The only way Karl Marx, who's also accused of being Jewish, the only way that the Jew can become a communist is by stopping being a Jew, because it's not an extension of Judaism. It is a refutation and abandonment of Judaism. If these guys had ever, the Communism is Jewish people had ever bothered to read Karl Marx on Judaism or communism, they would realize that they're full of crap. But I'm hoping that people will hear this and will realize, if they've been sucked in by this, that they're completely wrong. If somebody has told you that communism is Jewish, they're completely wrong. Here's Karl Marx saying literally that if you are a Jew, to become a communist, you have to stop being Jewish. Because that would be working for his human emancipation, that's communism, as such, and turns against the supreme practical expression of human self-estrangement. What was the practical expression of human self-estrangement? Private property. So by stopping being Jewish, he could turn against private property, and thus he could become a communist. We recognize in Judaism, he says, therefore, a general antisocial element of the present time, which means anti-socialist, by the way, an element which, so there's Marx literally saying we recognize in Judaism anti-socialism. Communism is Jewish is not doing well in this discussion. We recognize in Judaism, therefore, a general anti-social or anti-socialist element of the present time, an element which, through historical development, to which in this harmful respect the Jews have zealously contributed because they like private property, because they worship money and huckstering, has been brought to its present high level, at which it must necessarily begin to disintegrate. In the final analysis, the emancipation of the Jews is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism. The Jew has already emancipated himself in a Jewish way. That's a line right there. So the whole essay is about the political emancipation of Jews. But he says, in the final analysis, the emancipation of the Jews, so political equality, is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism. And the only way you can get there is by getting rid of Judaism completely. But instead, he says the Jew has already emancipated himself in a Jewish way. He maintained his Judaism, self-interest, by trying to stay Jewish while getting political equality. and he calls it the Jewish way. Whew. A little skipping here. He says, this is no isolated fact. The Jew has emancipated himself in a Jewish manner, not only because he has acquired financial power, but also because through him and also apart from him, money has become a world power, and the practical Jewish spirit has become the practical spirit of the Christian nations. I have a feeling he's talking about banking there. So yet again, all the woke right anti-Jewish conspiracy theories are the same as the woke left anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, and they're here concentrated in Karl Marx. The Jews, he says, have emancipated themselves insofar as the Christians have become Jews. What does that mean? It means that they've also come to worship money and huckstering. Indeed, he says, in North America, the practical domination of Judaism over Christianity, over the Christian world, has achieved... What? So in North America, he's saying the Jews have taken over the Christians. What could he mean? Oh, greed, which he's identifying with being Jewish. Indeed, in North America, the practical domination of Judaism over the Christian world has achieved as its unambiguous and normal expression that the preaching of the gospel itself and the Christian ministry have become articles of trade. In other words, Christianity became Jewish because it became commercial. And the bankrupt trader, that's going to be your pastor, maybe at a megachurch, deals in the gospel just as the gospel preacher who has become rich goes in for business deals. So that's Marx's explanation of how Christianity in North America became Jewish by becoming a business that worships money. Judaism, he says a little bit later, has held its own alongside Christianity, not only as religious criticism of Christianity, not only as the embodiment of doubt and the religious derivation of Christianity, but equally because the practical Jewish spirit, Judaism, has manifested itself and even attained its highest development in Christian society. Let me remind you that means greed. He identifies Judaism with greed. The Jew, he says, who exists as a distinct member of civil society is only a particular manifestation of the Judaism of civil society. Judaism continues to exist not in spite of history, but owing to history. The Jew is perpetually created by civil society from its own entrails, because the Jew means the greedy person, guys. What in itself was the basis of the Jewish religion? Practical need and egoism. The monotheism of the Jew, therefore, he says, Marx says, is in reality the polytheism of the many needs, a polytheism which makes even the lavatory an object of divine law. Practical need, egoism is the principle of civil society, and as such appears in pure form as soon as civil society has fully given birth to the political state. The god of practical need and self-interest is money. Money is the jealous god of Israel, in face of which no other god may exist. So remember, it's about humans, not stuff. Humans, not profits. Humans, not money. You've heard that from the activists, woke left, and it turns out woke right. It's about people, not profits, right? Money is the jealous god of Israel, in face of which no other god may exist. That's what he says. Just let it just soak in how broken this is. Money, he says, degrades all the gods of man and turns them into commodities. Money is the universal self-established value of all things. It has therefore robbed the whole world, both the world of men and nature, of its specific value. Money is the estranged essence of man's work and man's existence, and this alien essence, money, not God, but he also calls God the alien essence, dominates him and he worships it. The God of the Jews has become secularized and has become the God of the world. There's a Gnostic claim, by the way. The bill of exchange is the real God of the Jew. His God is only an illusory bill of exchange. The view of nature attained under the domination of private property and money is a real contempt for and practical debasement of nature. In the Jewish religion, nature exists. It is true, but it exists only in imagination. Woo, Marx. Karl Marx, sounding like Hitler, and we aren't even to the really hot parts yet. He goes on, skipping just a little. Contempt for theory, art, history, and for man as an end in himself. There's the rub right there. Which is contained in an abstract form in the Jewish religion, is the real conscious standpoint, the virtue of the man of money. The species relation itself, the relation between man and woman, etc., becomes an object of trade. The woman is bought and sold. So there he's saying that Jews are responsible for prostitution. But not Jews as in Jews, but yes, Jews as in Jews, but also Christians as in Jews, as in greedy people as in Jews. Karl Marx is bringing it. The chimerical nationality of the Jews, notice that's because they're in diaspora, because they were driven out of Israel. The chimerical nationality of the Jews is the nationality of the merchant, of the man of money in general. Sounds exactly like Candace Owens. The groundless law of the Jew is only a religious caricature of groundless morality and right in general, of the purely formal rights with which the world of self-interests surrounds itself. Here, too, man's supreme relation is the legal one, his relation to laws that are valid for him, not because they are laws of his own will and nature, but because they are the dominant laws and because departure from them is avenged. Now, just to really tweak this up a notch, Jewish Jesuitism, the same practical Jesuitism which Bauer discovers in the Talmud, deal with that, Catholics, is the relation of the world of self-interest to the laws governing that world, the chief art of which consists in the cunning circumvention of these laws. Indeed, the movement of this world within its framework of laws is bound to be a continual suspension of the law. Judaism, he tells us, Karl Marx says, could not develop further as a religion, could not develop further theoretically, because the world outlook of practical need is essentially limited and completed in a few strokes. So Judaism has a very simplistic early worldview. It cannot get beyond because of its egoism and greed, and therefore the Jew cannot become a communist. Remember that their claim is that communism is a Jewish theory, but the Jew can't even become a communist. Karl Marx tells us, by its very nature, he says, Karl Marx says, the religion of practical need could find its consummation not in theory but only in practice, precisely because its truth is practice. Judaism could not create a new world. It could only draw the new creations and conditions of the world into the sphere of its activity. Notice that Judaism trying to create a new world would be literally heresy against Judaism. Communism is trying to create a new world, which it says it's not doing because it's just trying to complete the real world. Guess which one is not Jewish? So Judaism could not create a new world, he says. It could only draw the new creations and conditions of the world into the sphere of its activity because practical need, the rationale of which is self-interest, is passive and does not expand at will, but finds itself enlarged as a result of the continuous development of social conditions. Judaism, he tells us, reaches its highest point with the perfection of civil society, but it is only in the Christian world that civil society attains perfection. So what he's actually saying with the perfection of civil society, if you remember from earlier, is that Christianity going secular completes civil society. So Judaism can only complete civil society by stopping being Jewish and becoming Christian and stopping being state Christian and becoming secular Christian. Only, he says, under the dominance of Christianity, which makes all national, natural, moral, and theoretical conditions extrinsic to man, could civil society separate itself completely from the life of the state, sever all the species ties of man, put egoism and selfish need in the place of these species ties, socialism, and dissolve the human world into a world of atomistic individuals who are inimically opposed to one another. Wait a minute. What? The woke right complains that secularism has atomized people, but Karl Marx is arguing that it is in fact the completion of Christianity, and only through Christianity, that you could possibly end at the logical endpoint of a dissolved human world into an atomistic into a world of atomistic individuals who are inimically opposed to one another. Christianity, he tells us, sprang from Judaism. It has merged again in Judaism. Remember, by this, he means greed and the worship of money. From the outset, the Christian was the theorizing Jew. The Jew is therefore the practical Christian, and the practical Christian has become a Jew again. What does this little riddle mean? So the Christian was the theorizing Jew, so he took the very worldly Jewish religion and turned it into something sublime and theoretical. And the Jew became the practical Christian because he's the one that's demanding his equality. And then the practical Christian has become a Jew again because he's consumed by greed. So the whole thing is a wash. It's all bad. Nobody's communist at all. Everything gets totally ruined. And the problem actually is the Jew who's not giving up Judaism in both cases. Christianity, he said, had only in semblance overcome real Judaism. Real Judaism, right? It was too noble-minded, too spiritualistic to eliminate the crudity of practical need in any other way than by elevation to the skies. So Christianity is not so good for Marx. It had only in semblance overcome real Judaism, which is greed and money, right? The love of money. Christianity had only pretended to care about the poor. It was too noble-minded, too spiritualistic. It didn't care about the real world of poverty. It only cared about the noble spiritual world. And so the crudity of practical need was not overcome. Instead, it was elevated. It was overcome by elevating greed and practical need and worship of money to the skies. So he's saying that Christianity became very, very greedy. And part of the reason is because we never solved the Jewish question, which was to abolish Judaism entirely, which is to abolish the love of money entirely in Marx's formulation. Christianity, he says, is a sublime thought. I didn't say that. I didn't articulate that well. Christianity is the sublime thought of Judaism. Judaism is the common practical application of Christianity, but this application could only become general after Christianity as a developed religion had completed theoretically the estrangement of man from himself and from nature. Only then. So Christianity is what actually broke man fully away from himself and from nature. And Christianity developed itself as a religion, but that could this application, which is the practical application of Christianity, Judaism, the love of money, is the common practical application of Christianity. So is what Christianity tends to do, is the love of money. But it could only be this way after Christianity developed a religion that had completed theoretically the estrangement of man from himself and nature. So the spiritual views of Christians estrange man from himself and nature through their religious activity. And what this actually does is makes Christians love and worship money because they no longer understand their real role in nature because they've separated themselves from it with their religion. So Christianity is really bad here too. Only then, Marx said, could Judaism, the love of money, achieve universal dominance and make alienated man and alienated nature into alienable, vendable objects that you can sell, subjected to the slavery of egoistic need and to trading. Selling, he says, is the practical aspect of alienation. So selling is the thing the Jews do. So this rant is about to get super hot. It's pretty nasty so far, but you're following me. This is how Marx felt about religion in practice, or he's talking about Jews and Christians in practice because they're not communist. So this is the stuff this is why he thinks it all needs to get cleared out. It's not that you have this relationship with the Creator. It's not that you have a covenant. It's not that none of this. It's all just boils down to, because of the Jew, it all just boils down to the egoism and the love of money. In other words, egoism means individuality, which means not being a communist. And the love of money is the love of private property, which means not being a communist. Remember the two things that he said you had to get rid of way back at the beginning in the EPM that we were talking about? Atheism was going to be getting rid of God. You were going to get rid of your egoism. And you have to get rid of private property in order to get both a theoretical and practical humanism to be able to fuse into communism. Oh my gosh. So Judaism and Christianity are the egoism and love of money that are in the way of that, because practical need has not been abolished because we still believe in private property and don't have communism. Now the fun part of the rant. Just as man, he says, as long as he is in the grip of religion, is able to objectify his essential nature only by turning it into something alien, something fantastic. Again, that means fantasy, not great. So under the domination of egoistic need, he can be active practically and produce objects in practice only by putting his products and his activity under the domination of an alien being and bestowing the significance of an alien entity, money, on them. That's a complicated sentence. Just as man, as long as he's in the grip of religion, is able to objectify his essential nature by turning it into something alien, in other words, spiritual imago Dei, God is the ultimate alien. This is a Gnostic construct where God is the alien and there's a higher perfected God beyond that. Something fantastic, he says, something that doesn't really exist. So your nature, your essential nature gets turned into something fantastic, child of God, something alien, child of God. Only by doing that, he says, so long as he's in the grip of religion, can he says, under the domination of egoistic need, in other words, can he be active practically and produce objects in practice only by putting his products and his activity under the domination of another alien being, namely money. Okay, so as long as man lives in the grip of religion and doesn't understand who he really is and what his real needs are, he's going to have to understand himself through practical value. In other words, money, which is an alien force that becomes a golden calf or object of worship that replaces real worship, not of God in a truly devout or real way, but of money, of self, of individuality. That's Marx's argument. In other words, as long as you're a religious person, you have to worship money, and you can't worship man as God. That's the summary based on everything we've talked about so far. So this is why you need atheism, because you get that all out of the way, and then you can build the communist farm on top of that, is what my point is with this podcast. It says, in its perfected practice, Christian egoism of heavenly bliss is necessarily transformed into the corporal egoism of the Jew, money. Heavenly need is turned into world need, subjectivism into self-interest. We explain the tenacity of the Jew not by his religion, his covenant with God, his relationship with his Creator, but on the contrary by the human basis of his religion, which is practical need in egoism, greed, and self-interest, in other words, not being communist, in other words, private property and self-interest or individuality are the things in the way. Since, he says, Karl Marx says, since in civil society the real nature of the Jew has been universally realized and secularized, civil society could not convince the Jew of the unreality of his religious nature. Civil society, even when it offers total political equality to Jews, can't convince Jews that that the reality of his religion is that he worships money and there's nothing religious there at all. That's what Karl Marx has just said. He says, since in the civil society the real nature of the Jew, love of money, has been universally realized and secularized, civil society could not convince the Jew of the unreality of his religious nature, which is indeed only the ideal aspect of practical need. Consequently, not only in the Pentateuch and the Talmud, or Torah and Talmud if you want, but he said Pentateuch, which I don't think he would if he was Jewish, guys. Consequently, not only in the Pentateuch and the Talmud, but in the present-day society, we find the nature of the modern Jew, and not as an abstract nature, meaning a religious one, but as one that is in the highest degree empirical, not merely as a narrowness of the Jew, but as the Jewish narrowness of society. So the highest degree empirical there refers to within the materialist sociology, materialist sociology that I discussed earlier. So you're going to see the Jew basically in terms of the love of money, and then that's going to reveal not merely as narrowness of the Jew, but as the Jewish narrowness of society. The Jew, as Karl Marx is framing it, views society in a very narrow way through practical self-interest and egoism rather than the possibility of the emancipation to communism. I once again assert that Karl Marx is very much against the idea that communism is a Jewish theory. just going to point out how strongly against that idea Karl Marx is here. So he concludes finally, once society has succeeded in abolishing the empirical essence of Judaism, huckstering in its preconditions, meaning money, the Jew will have become impossible, and money is predicated on private property. Once society has succeeded in abolishing money, the Jew will have become impossible because his consciousness no longer has an object, because all the Jew thinks about is money and private property and himself and egoism. Because the subjective basis of Judaism, practical need, has been humanized. That means made communist and socialist. And because the conflict between man's individual sensuous experience and his species existence means sensuous experience is not like a romantic phrase. What it means is how you actually perceive the world with your senses. So once you get rid of the private property and you get rid of the individualism, so there's no egotism and there's no practical need, then there's no huckstering, then the Jew will become impossible because his consciousness is no longer has an object. He can't worship his God as money, so he doesn't have a God to worship anymore. So he just won't be a Jew anymore. Because he says the subjective basis of Judaism, which is practical need, has been abolished by turning it communist. He calls it humanized. And because therefore the conflict between man's individual sense experience and his species existence, his nature as a true social communist, has been abolished. The conflict between self and community has been abolished by getting rid of private property, thus getting rid of the basis for the Jew's self-interest and thus egoism and thus love of money. The social emancipation of the Jew, he concludes, is the emancipation of society from Judaism. But remember what he means by that. The social emancipation of the Jew is the emancipation of society from the love of money and self, which of course is all anti-Jewish. Okay, there we go. That's from Karl Marx, 1843, on the Jewish question. So let's wrap up. I'm going to read the articulation of communist faith from economic philosophic manuscripts to wrap up, but I want to frame it first and we'll just shut up. The relationship between atheism and communism is that the other religions are flatly in the way. They preserve the love of stuff and self, individualism. Both Christianity and Judaism are particularly named as vile and such, primarily because Christianity has been made Jewish, where Jewish means love of money and self, according to Karl Marx, because of his analysis of the so-called Jewish question, and that the solution to this is either to get rid of the material basis that causes people to have a religion in the first place. In other words, to get rid of practical need, deprivation, alienation, estrangement, in other words, private property. But people will never do this as long as they have their religion, Karl Marx thinks. But of course, like I said repeatedly through the podcast, liberation theology and the social gospel and black liberation theology and so on show us that, in fact, they can skip the atheism step. So atheism is presented as I would say necessary but insufficient condition of producing communism, but it is not actually necessary. So it is just a kind of like stopping point along the way, according to Karl Marx, that later communists discovered doesn't work. The Bolsheviks and the communists in the Soviet Union discovered it doesn't work. The Petsty experiments in the Romanian prisons discovered it doesn't work. And the communists eventually realized that they had to subvert people to communism directly through Christianity and Judaism rather than trying to get them to throw away their religion so they could be converted to communism. But the general idea that Karl Marx had with communism was that atheism is not communism. It's not even close to communism. It's totally not even close to communism. It's totally insufficient. And he would have regarded atheism as barely better than being religious. It's like having a field that you bought that's covered in natural growth that you haven't plowed when you have religion and that you have cleared but haven't planted anything when you're an atheist. And if you want to grow a communist crop, you've got to get the other religions out of the way, or as it turns out, subvert them, as they learned later, and then plant the communist crop. So atheism is just a state in which the communist crop could be planted without the competition of another religion. So is communism atheist? The answer is no, But it depends on what you mean by atheist. Does it believe in a literal, external, sovereign God? No, it does not. It believes in mankind as his own God, who he's going to worship as his own true S-U-N son, the object of his own creation. And that means mankind as a whole, but as a perfect communist collective, as the culmination of the process of history, is the God of communism, and it believes fully in that God and in actualizing that God through completing the process of history by practicing communism to bring it about. And so, no, communism, first of all, is a religion, and no, it's not atheist in the sense that it has no absolutely total and sovereign object of worship. It is the perfected Alpha and Omega man of the completion of history that represents its God. Man is his own God, and he worships himself. That is the point. But it's not you or me or any single man. It is mankind overall worships himself overall as a true actualized species being with no self-interest or individual egoism left. Complete and perfect socialist man across the entire society. So this lets me read the articulation of faith from the economic and philosophic manuscripts that comes just right before some of what I read before. He says the entire movement of history, this is their article of faith, the entire movement of history, just as communism's actual act of genesis, the birth act of its empirical existence, is therefore for its thinking consciousness, that's people, the comprehended and known process of its becoming. That sounds weird. What does he mean? The entire movement of history, which is the birth act of communism, is when all of the people understand that communism is becoming a reality through them. That's it. But it involves the thinking consciousness has the comprehended and known process of its becoming. So the article of faith is, in communism, is when we all believe in communism, communism is coming. This is the ultimate faith of the communist. Communism is always becoming through the unending process of resolving class conflict through revolutionary action, through men who understand the point. He says, whereas the still immature communism seeks a historical proof for itself, a proof in the realm of what already exists, among disconnected historical phenomena opposed to private property, tearing single phases from the historical process and focusing attention on them as proofs of its historical pedigree. He says that by comparison. It doesn't, he's just putting down this immature communism. So what he's saying is immature communism, which doesn't have the fullness of communist faith, seeks historical proofs for itself. It wants to see in the world that communism is working through disconnected historical phenomena that are opposed to private property, tearing single phases from the historical process and focusing on attention on them as proofs of its historical pedigree. That is immature, but the mature communism is the entire movement of history, just as communism's actual act of genesis, the birth act of its empirical existence, is therefore for its thinking consciousness, which is the awakened humans of socialist Gnosticism, the comprehended and known process of its becoming. So the article of faith of communism is, you don't need proof. You have exactly what Hebrews 11 talks about. It is the trust in that which is not seen, the confidence in the promise that will be delivered, that if we become communists and we act as communists and we comprehend the known process of the becoming of communism into the world by being communist, then communism will arrive. And communism represents the next stage of the human development, the completion of man in this stage of his existence that ends the class conflict and enables his future development. Man as God directing his own development. That's communism. That's the faith. And just to draw the parallel, you hear some of these people out there saying that the point of Christianity is Christ consciousness. But no, communism is going to represent the Christ consciousness, which is the awakening of the godlike mind, the mind of God. That's what Christ consciousness actually means, is the mind of God in the Hermetic belief system. So people with Christ consciousness include Christ and Buddha and probably Russell Brand or something. And these people are talking about something completely different. Well, the communist has something like Christ consciousness, where we are all perfectly sharing in a veritable earthly kingdom of God with one another, ruled over by man for man in perfect harmony across everyone through the self-sacrifice of the state as the worldly instantiation of God, the socialist state specifically. And it's like, oh my God, the whole thing. You can just see it. So communism means the arrival of Christ consciousness in the communist religion, where man is his own Christ. And so man is his own God. And does that mean communism is atheist? Like, Ayn Rand didn't believe this crap. Like, most of the people in the atheist movement that didn't go wacky socialist don't believe this crap. So no, communism in the final analysis, it does depend on what you mean by atheist. But no, communism's not atheist. Communism doesn't like Christianity or Judaism or their God. Communism likes itself as its own God, as its own Christ. And as such, it is deeply, deeply, not quite theistic, but like anthropology, whatever it is for man. It's man God. So man is his own God. It's not man becoming a godlike figure and worshiping himself still counts as a kind of twisted theism. So no, it's not atheistic in that kind of sense. So I answered that question. I hope this was edifying. I know it was very long. It's actually a lot longer than I meant it to be. But it's always fun to share Karl Marx with you and to dispel lots of myths about Karl Marx that can be easily dispelled merely by the wild and crazy act of reading him and seeing what he actually said. Catch you on the next one.